I should start with just a few notes of housekeeping. And the first and most important one is that we're not expecting a fire alarm drill this afternoon. Had we been, it would have been really unfortunate planning. So there shouldn't be a fire alarm. If there is, we'll know about it. And in the event that there is, then we are requested to, sort of in a very calm and thoughtful way, but purposeful nonetheless, make our way through that door and then through the doors at the front. And the assembly point is cockpit steps, so I think that's out of the door, left, and then left again, and it's those rather funky little steps that lead down to the pub at the bottom. I don't know why I thought about the pub at the bottom. Anyway, otherwise, just to say as well that there are loos around the place. So if you go out and go to the right down there, there are some loos down there, and of course downstairs there are also some other facilities if anyone needs it. Even today, I'm very conscious that many people who I'd hoped to see here have had to cry off because they've tested positive. And so what I would ask is if you do feel a sort of a tickle coming on, don't feel that politeness requires that you stay here and cough, but feel that you are absolutely allowed to go and go outside, have a glass of water and sort of recover your poise before re-entering here. There is a social media thing that I have to say, which I can never remember because I don't do social media myself. But anyway, please, if you are a tweeter, then feel free to tweet during the course of the afternoon session. If anything does strike you as being particularly interesting or worthy of sharing, then please do tweet. And the hashtag is EVET 2022. I think I will now move on to... Oh, and I suppose I should introduce myself, shouldn't I? Which I was very neglectful. So my name's Philip New. My day job is as the Chief Executive of the Energy Systems Catapult. Much more importantly, for this afternoon's purpose, I've also had the real privilege and pleasure of chairing the task force over the last, ever since it was started, actually. So it's just grand on behalf of all of us in the task force to welcome everyone here. So why are we here? We'll be talking a lot about this as the afternoon goes forward, but I thought it would be worth sort of sharing a few sort of headlines right up front. So we're here because we are launching today a report Charging the Future, Drivers of Success in 2035. This is a major departure for the task force, which historically was very focused on the implications for the energy system of widespread vehicle charging and the opportunities that would come from aligning the electrification of transport with the evolution of the electricity system. The departure has come, and it was prompted in part by many conversations around the broader ecosystem, around the importance of not neglecting what happens with the public charging infrastructure. So this report builds on everything that we've talked about in the past around the electricity network and the energy system, but it is a significant expansion because it starts to talk about what might need to happen to enable an overall charge point and charging infrastructure to be delivered sufficient to support the delivery of the ambitious goals that have been laid out not only in the 10-point plan but also in the 6th carbon budget. And when we were conceptualizing this, we started to use the language of trying to define a minimum viable system, which makes sense if you come from a particular sort of engineering discipline, but can sound a little bit dour and kind of constraining for people who have got a sort of a less educated relationship with the English language. And so we're now calling it the sweet spot. And so what you'll be hearing about and what underpins much that's in the report is a definition of what a charge point network might look like if it is to meet a sweet spot that is a combination of a network that is sufficiently dense and accessible, that it supports consumer confidence. People feel that they're okay to buy a car because they feel confident, they know that they can find a charging point, not only in their garage, but also on the highway. A charge point, moreover, that is going to be usable, that is going to be fair, that is going to be accessible. A charge point that will be priced within the reach of everyone who needs to drive. And critically, a charge point that is going to be investable, so that it isn't dependent on prolonged government subsidy and bailing out to be able to get there. Now, when you start to think about all of those conflicting, because they are potentially conflicting forces, you realise that the sweet spot is actually quite a narrow little zone, sort of an overlap of the various, in a sort of a Venn diagram, right? There's that narrow zone there, but the modelling work that's been done is an attempt to characterise what the dimensions of that sweet spot might be. So we're going to spend some time understanding from the modelling team about how that's been done. And then we're going to be, and the report also then goes into what we call the enabling conditions. So here are the 5 things that the task force has picked out as being absolutely critical to be delivered if that sweet spot is to be reached in the 2030 to 35 time window, right? So it's pretty urgent. And so they're them. And again, there'll be lots of conversation and discussion led by Andy towards the end of the afternoon as we go through what the enabling conditions are in order for us to get there. So in terms then of the agenda, so in a second, we'll be hearing from the Minister for Transport, Minister Harrison, who'll be giving us a keynote talk. Then I'll be joined on stage by Katie Black, who's a co-head at OZEV, an opportunity for us to explore a little bit more, go perhaps a little bit behind the curtain around what informed the strategy. And then I'll be reflecting a bit on the journey so far, just as a final piece of context setting before we get into the first of the panel sessions, where we'll have an opportunity to hear from EVA England and BVRLA around what is driving demand, what consumers and customers are really looking for from the charging network. After which we'll hear about the modelling, so the characterisation and how we got there of this sweet spot. We'll then talk about some of the enabling conditions in much more depth, so an opportunity to hear from some experts in the field around what it is that is necessary to make this investable and what it is that's necessary to make this really usable. Andy will then take us through the enabling conditions as a whole, and then we'll finish with an opportunity to have a glass of wine together and build on all the relationships that have been forged over the last few years, and hopefully fresh relationships that will be forged this afternoon. So I'll end it there. I'll stop there, and now I think it's time to listen, much more importantly, to what the Minister has to tell us. So, do you want me to push this?
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I wish I could be there in person, but I am glad that I haven't missed out entirely. The theme of today's conference is Delivering the Electric Dream, and it offers me the opportunity to talk about the future of electric vehicles, to highlight investment in EV infrastructure, and to quote 1980s electro hit singles. I'm not about to belt out pop classics, but I do want to make a song and dance of the EV charging infrastructure strategy that my department published last week. The strategy is the most recent step in building the sustainable future at the heart of transport. Steps that have picked up the pace over recent years as we deliver on the government-wide aim to decarbonise our economy. We've committed to phasing out the sale of new petrol and diesel cars and vans by 2030. We ratcheted up the scale of ambition so that all new cars and vans will be fully zero emission at the tailpipe from 2035. These are bold plans, and I'm grateful for the support of so many industry colleagues in energy and infrastructure, manufacturers and consumer groups. Over a challenging couple of years, you've supported our plans to charge into the future. You have bought into the electric dream. Investment has poured into battery technology to accelerate towards that future. EVs are getting cheaper, more efficient, faster, easier to run. They're a dream to drive. And as EVs become the logical next step for more and more motorists, my focus turns to rolling out a robust, fair and scalable charging network right across the country. The goal is to weave EV infrastructure into the fabric of our everyday life. Combining charging with our smart energy system, delivering benefits to the grid and the potential for lower cost or even negative electricity tariffs for those willing to charge flexibly. There are big benefits bounding down the track, but making EV the norm requires us to approach the coming years with a consumer focus. That's exactly the approach taken up in our EV infrastructure strategy, which we published last week. Our strategy has been informed by work of the EV Energy Taskforce, and we welcome the publication of their latest report today, which will provide further zero-emission fuel for thought. Our infrastructure strategy will ensure the UK is EV fit by 2030. We'll invest over £1.6 billion in supporting the rollout of hundreds of thousands of charge points nationwide before 2030. We're pledging to keep knocking down the barriers for private sector investment because we know we need to foster the fertile conditions to allow green industry to flourish. And what are these conditions? We want everyone to have reliable and convenient access to public charging wherever they live or drive. We expect around 300,000 public chargers as a minimum by 2030. And we'll need a diverse mix of charging solutions because across our great cities and towns and villages, we cannot drive forward with a one-size-fits-all approach. There are three main challenges that we know need addressing: improving the consumer experience, accelerating the pace of rollout, and ensuring convenient and speedy charging for long journeys. Our interventions will focus on improving local public charging and en route charging. We're supporting the accelerated rollout of a comprehensive rapid charging network on major roads. We're levelling up the provision of local public charge points, including a £500 million infrastructure package, with an obligation on local authorities to develop plans, subject to consultation and legislation. This will involve launching a £10 million pilot, encouraging local government to apply for funding to springboard ambitious charge point projects. And we'll continue to work with industry to make sure EV charging is easy and good for the energy system. We're working with Ofgem and the energy sector to make sure charge points are seamlessly integrated into a smart energy system, including supporting innovation to develop new technology and business models to deliver both the EV transition and a thriving UK charging sector. As part of that, building on our previous £30 million investment, last week we also announced over £10 million of new funding for innovation in vehicle-to-grid technologies. This won't be the final word on government action for charge points, but it sets our direction for the next phase of EV uptake, to move to mass market. Government is only one part of creating the conditions for this sector to flourish. It will be organic, market-led and consumer-driven. And the private sector has a critical role to play in providing convenient, affordable and reliable charging for all, We welcome that collaboration between the transport and energy sectors is building up and getting better, not least through initiatives such as the EV Energy Taskforce. And across this space, we must continue to build on these successes and evolve the task force as the EV and charging markets develop. And we are evolving. The task force has added significant value to government's work by reconciling often diverging views, facilitating a joint industry position, and serving as a trusted expert group where officials can test policy and strategies. It's been a constructive and supportive voice for the EV transition, including on specific policies. However, the policy landscape and market has changed rapidly since EVET was established, not least with the government's commitment to phase out sale of petrol and diesel vehicles in 2030. We've already seen EVET widen its focus to address EV charging infrastructure matters beyond pure energy issues. Therefore, we will reassess the role and scope of the task force to ensure that we build on its success as a constructive model for cross-sectoral engagement. We will continue to keep you updated with this evolution. We have a lot of complex work in front of us, but I know just how committed we all are to accelerating the future of a fair and sustainable EV revolution. We've exciting times ahead of us. And whilst I won't sing it out loud, I will say that I'm looking forward to working together to charge the future, together in electric dreams. Thank you.
I don't know whether you clap a video recording, but anyway, I thought that was quite good. So thank you, Minister. But with that, Katie, if you could come up and join us. And I suppose we just sort of sit down here somehow. And we're running a bit tight on time. So what I thought I'd do is just ask Katie, abuse my positional power here. I'm going to ask Katie a couple of questions, but you'll be around for the whole afternoon. So I'm sure that if anyone's got anything really burning, they'll be able to find Katie at the coffee break later. Look, we're all really thrilled to see at last the infrastructure strategy published, and you know, the commentary that I've heard has been really positive about it, right? Lots of people saying it's ticked many of the boxes that people have been worrying about. But you know, not everything is straightforward, is it? So is there anything in there that gives you particular concern as you think about how it's going to be implemented? What are the most worrying bits of it for you?
So I think we're also very, very happy that we've managed to get it published. And it's fantastic to be able to share it and to talk to people and get their reactions to it. And it's great that those, as you say, reactions seem to be fairly positive. I think hopefully what we've managed to achieve is set out quite a clear vision and an ambition and make it really clear that government is very serious about this. We've provided some extra information about how we're going to share, how we're going to spend some of the money that we got allocated to us at spending review last year. So the focus on sort of local charge point provision. I think the key challenge for OZEV is actually delivering and pushing out that money for others to start using and getting those charge points in the ground. So it's kind of like I'm not worried about the thinking for now. I'm worried about our ability to turn that round and make sure that people are making use of that funding everywhere in the country so that nowhere gets left behind. That's kind of our key task now.
So could you unpack that a little bit more for us? So what are some of the specific examples of where you might be worrying about your ability to get this stuff out there and done and delivered in the right way? I'm not up at night worrying about it. It's just right. What I perceive to be sort of our next big challenge. So it's obviously fantastic that this £500 million package that we've been able to put together and announce for local authorities, and I'm absolutely over the moon that we managed to get some resource funding to support local authorities. So we're not just saying go and do this, local authorities, and adding to their tasks. We're actually saying we're going to support you in doing this. We're going to give you some money to have people work for you and
actually bring brains together. And we've got a big package of support that they can draw on. We've launched a new hub for local government. So all that's great. Those local authorities, though, do have to be able to find those people and hire them quickly and start making a difference. Like, that's going to take a bit of time for us to work through how we can give it to them and how they can start finding them. So I think that's the sort of thing that I see as a bit of a challenge. We need to work out the best way to put that into practice, and then make sure that that translates into them being able to make the most of the much expanded, it was 80 million, now it's 400 million pounds local EV infrastructure fund. We want to make sure that that money is used in the best possible way, that we're getting all the learnings that we can get from it, and that we're really using it to stimulate the market for charge points, because ultimately, as the Minister said, we want this to be a market-led rollout.
And of course, there are all sorts of, sort of positive reinforcement loops if we get it right.
Exactly.
Empowering and enabling local authorities not only means that the immediate money gets invested really well, which stimulates activity not just in London, but more broadly across the country. Yeah. But it also means that then we start to see local area energy plans come forward in partnership with DNOs and others, which enables Ofgem and the regulator to feel more comfortable about really blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
I'm glad you can see how we want it to come together. I think, the challenge will be making it come together in that way.
So if that's the challenge, what do you take greatest delight in the strategy? What's the thing that you feel, that's brilliant?
I'm really, really pleased that we've got the consumer experience regulations, the next step, the response to that out, because I think that's the thing that's going to start making a difference to drivers now. I mean, a lot of people love to talk about the number of charge points we have, and that's very important, and again, it's said a lot, but that doesn't count for anything if you turn up for a charge point and you can't use it for whatever reason, or it's out of service and you can't find another one. So the biggest sort of tangible thing that we can do to make better use of the network that we have will be through some of that consumer experience work. So I'm really excited about that. And as I said, I'm really excited about the resource money that we've managed to get for local authorities, because I didn't think we'd be able to make the case for that.
Now, what I found really interesting about the sort of the journey we've been on in EVA over the last sort of 18 months is that as we've got deeper and deeper into the sort of the context, new issues, new challenges have cropped up. So, as an example, and we'll hear a little bit about this in a while, I'm sure, the absolutely critical importance of commercial customers providing, in many cases, the most challenging and critical use cases around how the infrastructure needs to be deployed is something that I think we were a bit blind to at the beginning and now are very sensitive to. The issues of equity and accessibility, again, were kind of there, but now they're here, right? They've really come to the forefront. Another one that's come through loud and clear is connectivity, right? We've got this sort of, it's all very well talking about the energy system and charging and interactions with mobility, but then we've got communications networks and communications capacity. And there is a degree of concern that is building around this. Any thoughts on how that features in OZEV's thinking at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an issue that we're aware of, and we really welcome it having, it's one of those things that's been fed up through to us. So that's fantastic. Well, the issue itself is not fantastic. It's something that we need to take very seriously. It's not just charge point related. No. So it applies to smart motorways and signage and lighting, apparently, in some rural areas. So I think the task for us is to make sure that we're joining up both across DFT and wider government to make sure that there is a unified approach to sorting this and taking it seriously. And I think correspondingly there's a task on the other side, perhaps through bodies such as EVET, to join up across industry, because I think one of the things that we're slightly worrying about is different industries acting a bit in isolation on these issues as well. So yes, I think it's a good example of where there's things that we need to look at and continue trying to progress.
Yeah, when we're engaged in this massive transition of not just one set of infrastructures, but multiple infrastructures. And, it's almost a sort of not merely a doubling, right? It's a massive multiplying effect as we start to get different infrastructure ecosystems interacting with each other and making sure they're coordinated at the joint. So, look, that's great. Is there, last thing, is there any, you've got this, assembly of people from across the sector here. Is there any message that you really want to get out to industry and stakeholders more broadly in the context of the strategy that's just been published, Katie?
I think the biggest thing I would have to say would be thank you, because we drew on so many people's input to put the document together, and the input that we got was so valuable. And I think the fact that the report that you've published today, there's so much kind of overlap and common themes, and it's just, I think, an example of really great collaboration. And so thank you to everybody that we spoke to in putting it together, and I hope that can continue.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katie. And we'll be hearing from Katie later in a panel session this afternoon as well.
Right.
But thank you very much. So, this is just to very, very quickly complete the sort of context setting before we start to move into some of the deeper conversations in the panel sessions. Clearly, from an EVET point of view, we massively welcome the strategy. And as Katie mentioned, I mean, the fact that there were so many areas of convergence is something that we're really pleased with. And it feels as though across the whole ecosystem of all of the stakeholders, all the people involved in this, there is a gradually increasing sense of commonality and common purpose. So it feels much less sort of spread out and divergent in terms of thinking than was the case only a couple of years ago. So I think that's fantastic. For me, one of the biggest takeaways from the strategy work has been the message that the Minister did a fine job, I thought, of reinforcing in her keynote. Collaboration really is key. It's utterly critical to this. And of course, I would argue that is what EVET is all about, really. I would characterize EVET as a collaboration of collaborations. So when you look at the organizations that are represented on our steering committee, you can see that all of them themselves, or almost all of them, are collaborative bodies in their own right. And it enables us to have a breadth of engagement across the various different perspectives of stakeholders across the space that I think is really special. And it's something that we absolutely need to build on and maintain. I would also say that it's not just been about, and this has been one of the really most pleasurable things about working with EVET over the last 18 months or so. It's not just been about the collaboration within the group of actors that are most directly involved with EVET. It's also been the way in which we've started to connect with other collaborative groups across the space. And in particular, I'd call out the growing collaboration and engagement and interaction between the energy world and the automotive world that was characterized by the Road Transport Transitions Committee, which I think did a lovely job of pulling us all together and helping us sort of nut through some of the issues at the boundary there. And then from the Build Back Better Business Council, the EV Fleets Accelerator is another lovely example of another entity that started to grow up, started to think about how different companies could collaborate to drive forward the electrification of commercial transport, and again that we were able to engage with really constructively. And collaboration deeply informs all of the work that we're sharing today. Whether it was the debates that took place, sometimes quite heated, around what the assumptions should be that underpin and went into the modelling work, or the scrutiny and you know, again, often quite heated conversations that happened as people kicked around some of the outputs and the conclusions from there, and as we were forming and trying to gel around what those enabling conditions should be. So this idea of collaboration and being able to bring the best of everyone together is absolutely fundamental. I would also say that then coming with that is an obligation for transparency. So, you know, none of the assumptions, none of the outputs, none of the key data sets that have been used in the modelling work are black box. You know, they are absolutely open for all stakeholders to be able to see and scrutinise and challenge if you wish. If you think that we've got something wrong, then, you know, let us know. They have been heavily tested and debated, I do assure you, though. Just to, you know, build on that a little bit, you know, this is by no means an exhaustive list. Last count, there was well over 350. I think it's probably nearer 450 organisations from across the space that have been engaged with through EVET or its working groups or its in the journey that we've been on. You know, some stuff has happened between then, when we launched the first report in January of 2020, so when COVID was something we were still hearing about as sort of bulletin item 4 at the 9 o'clock news, you know, as this thing that was beginning to worry people in China, and today. In January we launched the original report. There it is. And then in November we tried to take some of the things that were proposals here and crystallise them a little bit more, turn them into more actionable messages. And that leads us to today, where we're launching the next major report from the task force. But there has been an awful lot of other stuff happening along the way. We've been running 5 task forces through that process, work groups through that process, and have you know, a number of separate reports that have been published under the aegis of the task force, all of which have contributed to the thinking that is reflected in the report that we're launching right now. And of course, there has been an awful lot going on across the sector as a whole. So again, I'm not going to pretend for a second that this is an absolutely exhaustive list, and I'm sure if your pet deliverable or achievement is missing from here, I apologise in advance. It wasn't a conscious choice, but just to try and you know, highlight the momentum that is building around all of this, and we've clustered this around the 5 enabling conditions that we're talking about. But in terms of building the public charging network, you know, the evidence that private investors are stepping up and starting to put their money in is growing all the time. And even, you know, last week we were hearing from both Shell and BP committing very significant amounts of capex into public charging infrastructure development, and they are, of course, by no means exclusive. There's a really exciting range of independent actors, challengers, and others coming in. So that's a very vibrant, dynamic market that's growing there. Project Rapid and all the work that Katie and the Minister were talking about in terms of supporting deployment is now starting to play through. We believe that, and you know, the commitment from Ofgem is there, that RIIO-2 should be enabling and encouraging investment ahead of need. And the Green Recovery Plan, before RIIO-2 really kicks in, you know, did start to deploy some funds to support the reinforcement of network connections in service of deepening charging infrastructure. Integrated energy and transport planning, absolutely critical. For my money, the thing that is one of the weaker parts of the jigsaw at the moment. Very good to hear Katie's language around the commitment to resolve that and the resource that's been made available to support local authorities here. Absolutely needs to be done. Absolutely fundamental for all the reasons that we were talking about earlier. Some progress, more to do. Used and usable. Again, there is some good work happening. I was really heartened to read in the strategy about the commitment to hold people to account for charge points that don't work. That is really important. If we are all about trying to build, this is all about making sure that all the ships rise on the same tide, and if that means that we have to have confidence in users, then charge points have to be easy to use. They have to work. You have to be able to have the confidence that when you rock up, not only is it available, but it's working. So I think there's more to do, but some stuff happening in the space anyway. Smart charging, something that we were very familiar with from the initial EVET report. Still, I think, some gaps there, particularly around market design, very, very complicated. But again, signs that Bezos, Gem and others are beginning to really grasp the nettle on what needs to happen to make sure that incentives for consumers are in the right place to support smart charging coming through. And then some good foundational work that's been done on informing, educating and protecting EV users. But Andy will be going through all of these and taking us into where we go from here towards the end of the session. One last thing before I hand over to Andy and we hear much more around what customers are asking of charge points in the charging network. It's often tempting for us to come up with these long lists of things that, it's really important government and the regulator does in order for an outcome to occur. As though industry in some way is sort of taking a little bit of a back seat and saying, after you, government, and you do the hard yards and we'll step in behind you. And so I wanted to highlight this as a lovely little small story, but useful story of a case where actually industry picked up the baton. And this was Proposal 6 from the original plan, the original document. And there were huge debates about this, sort of 2 or 3 years ago. And this is all about if, the network is having a bit of a bad time, what rights do the network operators have to intercede on the provision of electricity for the charge point in your home? And as you can imagine, we had people from the network saying, look, we just have to step in here, otherwise there's going to be blackouts and brownouts and it's going to be really horrible. And we had representatives of the charge point sector saying that would be a disaster because how do we trust you to be able to do that in a responsible way? And you might be denying the opportunity for really innovative solutions to occur that might obviate the need for much of these interventions in the first place. I caricature the complexity of the debate massively there. Apologies. Under the leadership of the joint leadership of Energy UK and SSE, a cross-sectoral group got together. They've spent 2 years on it, they've nutted it out, and they've come up with an aligned position. This was after an initial attempt to put in a code reform and everything else really didn't get very far. And we've had some interesting sort of media coverage of this point. But the thing that I take great heart from is, here's a lovely example of industry working together to come up with a solution. So, kind of well done us, really. And if anyone does have any questions about it, hopefully Richard from SSE and Charles from Energy UK are with us and will be able to share some of what the real story behind this was later on. But with that, I'm going to shut up and hand over to Andy.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Phil. We'll give Phil a little bit of a rest now, and I'll try and cover the next couple of sessions. I think I won't go through lots of introductions and things like that. I think the key thing that's been highlighted today is the amount of work that's gone over the last 4 years and the collaborative nature of that. And we started out with EVET back in 2018, and I remember those early debates about putting the consumer, the user, at the heart of everything we did. And I think that's what we want to lead into. We've seen, over the last few weeks, we've seen a plethora of documents, including the infrastructure strategy from OZEV, the SMMT's own infrastructure plan, and the SMMT Electrified, very successful event. And we are seeing, resonating throughout all of these documents, that the consumer has to be at the heart of everything we do. And I think it's really reassuring, the consumer and the user probably, to see that come through from every sector of industry. And on that basis, that's exactly what we want to listen to now, is the voice of the consumer and the voice of the user. So I'm very pleased that we've got two eminent speakers. James Court is here from EVA England. I think this is James's first speaking occasion as the new chief exec of EVA England. The electric vehicle associations have been growing around the UK, and about a year ago I think EVA England was formed. I know because I've just paid my renewal subscriptions today. So James will help us understand a bit more about what the consumers are thinking, and we can hear from those people that really talk at the coalface. And then following that, Catherine from BVRLA will really bring that vital voice of the fleet users. More than 50% of the vehicles sold are to fleets, and BVRLA I know represent, and I don't know what the numbers are now, but it's several million vehicles I think under BVRLA. So it's really critical that we listen to these people using the vehicles, and we all sit up, take notice, and then move forward together with them. So with that, can I hand over to James to give us the consumer's perspective? Thank you, James.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. And yes, I think 11 days into this, and I think this is the first time I've given a presentation to real people for about 2.5 years. So it's nice to see reactions and not talking to half of the screens where you've all turned them off. I actually guess if some of you are getting a bit fearful, if you want to pretend that you've turned your monitor off, I guess you can just put the paper in front of your face. If that's, we've got to ease back into normal life. I'd also like to thank Yvette for the invitation to speak today. As I said, it is my first speaking event, and it's a fantastic event to be part of. So to start off, hopefully my presentation is up there. Just a quick introduction of who we are. As I said, we started just over a year ago. 7 dedicated EV drivers looking enviously at other countries such as Norway with a huge drivers association set this up, and it was a real passion project. Since then it's grown from strength to strength, and I'm glad that they've managed to get some funding so they can pay me to take this on. I've been involved with electric vehicles for what feels like a long time, but it's incredible how quickly the agenda's moved on, just in sort of 4 or 5 years. So I spent last year working in the COP office, in the Cabinet office, working on COP, on the transport policy. Before then, working with EV 100 and set up the UK Fleets Coalition, so worked very closely with BVRLA on those issues. And then before then was Director of Policy and Communications at the REA. And I think in 2015, 2016, we set up the APPG for electric vehicles and set up a membership for electric vehicle manufacturers. And I think back then it was still, the predictions of where EV ownership would be are miles out, as they were for other technologies like solar and wind. And I think it's incredible how quickly the momentum can build on this. So it's really pleasing to see already the government action on this, and as well as the driving numbers, which are quite frankly staggering where you think that we were 5 years ago. So on the consumer experience, I think we've talked already today about trying to put the consumers at the heart of things, and also talking about the convergence around the issues at play. And I think it is incredible over the last 2 weeks. It's sort of like buses. You wait for something and then 3 come along at once. And it's really interesting to look at where people have landed on. And I'd like to just highlight a survey that the EVA did last year, which got 1,000 respondents to talk about what their consumer experience was like and what they would like to see. A lot of this, I'm very pleased to say, has now been taken on, but I think we can talk about that in more detail, hopefully with Katie later on. Just out of interest, how many people here are electric vehicle drivers? Good Lord, and you're all EVA members. Okay, well, we can work on that. I will be sending out a link to all of you individually on how to become members and access our fantastic benefits. So I think for a lot of the room here, I hope this will all ring true. And for policymakers, I'm sure you've heard all of this and very pleased that a lot of it has been acted on. But this is what we thought a year ago. These were the experiences and common experiences that our members felt. In essence, they want chargers to be they want it to be easily located and access to reliable charge points. They want it to be easy to pay, and they want it to be, as I think all EV technologies are moving now, as good, if not better, than ICE vehicles. And I'm sure the drivers of EVs around here say they are better pieces of kit. We are not selling a hair shirt here. What we are selling is a better experience and a better future for transport. So, looking at the details on this, how do people want to pay? And I remember even sort of 5 years ago, I remember one of the drivers, one of the initial early adopters came in and showed me his phone. And I think he had 20 different apps on his phone, on the various different payment apps. It's got slightly better since then, but ultimately we asked, in an ideal world, how do you want to pay for things? And as you can see here, the overwhelming number of drivers wanted it to be contactless payments. I think people don't mind RFID cards. People don't mind having roaming memberships. But ultimately, and I think our member here puts it the best, is contactless is how you pay for most things. I can't remember the last time I paid by cash in a shop, let alone sort of contactless. And again, delighted to see that the consumer experience took that on board. The next thing is the roaming. And I think looking at this, you can get good deals from being through roaming memberships. We wouldn't want to impede on that. I think talking, what Philip said earlier about the Proposition 6, looking at areas where people can and businesses can get together, I think it is right that OZEV have put this onus on companies themselves, is that we don't want a monopoly, we certainly don't want one, but there needs to be more grouping on roaming companies and people need to find their own club on that. So I think the plan is in the next 2 years for people to sort their own houses on this, because it's clear that this is what drivers want, and hopefully businesses will take that nudge from government, and I'm sure in 2 years' time, if it hasn't happened, we will need to revisit this. But at the moment, it's all looking very positive. Charge point data. This is an area I'm really sort of keen to delve into later and to hear people's thoughts on this. I think this is so key. Is how do you choose the point that you go to? I think there are third-party apps at the moment that are fantastic, but even those aren't the most reliable. It's not their fault, they haven't got the data. This is one of those things, and I think there was a huge drive in government to talk about open data a few years ago, and we can see the huge changes that has driven. And I think having a market-based and a trust in the market delivering on this, open data could be a real key to trying to ease the options that you can have and the reliability you can have, because I think we can see here, and I think we can see later on, going to a charger and it not working is a hugely frustrating experience. So again, hopefully this will drive innovation, and I'd be particularly keen to find out where this data and how this data is going to be presented. And I think the consultation on that and some of the thinking is going to happen on that when the regulations come out soon. Icing, this is an area that we haven't particularly covered in the last couple of weeks, but is a real pet peeve of many EV drivers. Britain is not a particularly easy place for these things to happen with 400 odd councils, but there are things that we can do. So making sure that you have restrictions on who can park next to chargers. These are some easy things that we can do if we can sort of collaborate with the councils and have a signal sent from government. Penalties for blocking a charge point, this seems like a sensible way. Increasing the knowledge of ICE vehicles that this is not for them. I think some members would probably want to bring out a crossbow or some sort of corporal punishment. I think that's too excessive, but let's see how we get on in a couple of years' time. 24/7 call centre issues. Some of the figures around here, and I think the presentation is going to be sent around, so I won't go into all of the figures here, but it is shocking that you can see that over a third of drivers have had to change from the original charger that they wanted to use, and sometimes on the calls can be 2 times to up to 10 times. That is a huge frustration, and I think the step forward in having 24/7 call centres is a step in the right direction. Now, how companies deal with their consumer experience and the quality of that experience, I think, will probably play into the consumer choice. You know that some people have got excellent consumer service and some people haven't. Hopefully, again, companies will take that message and recognise that they have to not just have a 24-hour call centre, but the quality and the ability of the call service to handle issues. Because we can see here there are issues around disconnected calls, people not being able to give concise information or correct information, and people not being able to fix the problem. So again, an issue that I think we've put a marker down that you have to have a 24/7 call centre, but the quality of that will be something that we want to look at very clearly. Better signage. That you can see on motorway service stations, and you can see there are some good signage on that, not just within the MSA, the MSA itself about where the charges are, but along the roads, and especially on A roads, knowing how far away you are from your nearest charge point could be a real changer, not just for drivers, but I think in the same way that the little green flash on license plates, which I was a tad sceptical about, but actually the number of people that say, God, I'm seeing more and more of those green flashes, it becomes a bit more normalised, and I think it helps people to recognise that, well, the green flash has made people think that not just Pokemobiles, that there are some pretty nice-looking normal cars out there that are also electric. In the same vein, if you can see that that infrastructure on roads is there, it gives people that confidence. I'm going to quickly go over that. I mean, the 3,000 charges, I won't go into too much detail because I think probably Katie will go into this. For the further consultations, I think the really key thing, and the one that's coming up and just want to draw your attention to, is the accessibility for disabled consumers. The BSI have released a new consultation on that. It's a very short turnaround. I think there's it's under a month and the deadline is May the 4th. But I think a wide range of issues around accessibility and standards on charges, and that consultation is coming up. So please go and look at that. I think the deadline's May the 4th, so those of you who are going to fully charged, you might have to get it done before you have a fun weekend or be doing it on your desk during. That's the end of my presentation. As I said, I think it's fascinating that this was done a year ago, and so many of these have already been taken up by government, and we're already seeing improvements and people coalescing around these are the areas. So my final message, I think, would be to continue listening to EV drivers. Those who are EV drivers, you know that you are the best evangelicals on this, and you have the real experience. So personally delighted to be taking on this, this new job to try and put consumers at the heart of government thinking and trying to, I suppose, grow the industry and allay some of the fears and making sure that that message of your next car should be an EV, making that journey as easy as possible. Thank you.
James, thank you very much indeed. And I think I'd echo your commentary that actually so many of those things have come to the fore in the strategies and the documents that, that we're seeing now. As I mentioned earlier, the other critical, arguably bigger piece of the user jigsaw are the fleets. And I'm very pleased that Catherine Bowen from BVRLA is here to give us a bit of an overview of the fleets. Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Before I start, just to tell you a little bit about the BVRLA. So we are a trade association that represents the demand side of the automotive industry. Our members come from leasing, rental, car clubs, subscription and fleet management services. Our members own and operate 4 million cars, vans and trucks. So 1 in 10 cars, 1 in 5 vans and 1 in 5 trucks on the UK's roads will be owned and or operated by a BVRLA member. Our members are responsible for purchasing 50% of all new vehicles that are registered in the UK per annum. And by 2025, we expect around 80% of registrations for battery electric vehicles will be for a BVRLA member. So we're very much committed to the transition to road transport decarbonisation and recognise the critical role that we have to play in accelerating the uptake of zero-emission transport. So the BVRLA recently produced a fleet charging guide. The reason for this is when we first started to engage with the EV Energy Taskforce, and also in conversations that we were having with government ahead of the EV infrastructure strategy, it was quite clear that there was a bit of a blind spot and a knowledge gap when it came to fleets, particularly private sector fleets and those that aren't based at depots. So we wanted to produce this guide to support that understanding, but also recognising that more responsibility is being given to local authorities around the planning and provision of charge points. And quite often for fleets, they may not necessarily live or work within that local authority area. So we wanted to produce a guide that would help local authorities to understand the diversity of fleets, the user profiles, and then also some of the challenges that those fleets are going to have to overcome. And then looking at the journey profiles and the challenges, we've then been able to match the type of charging that we think will be required. That's then enabled us to produce a number of high-level policy recommendations, and it's fantastic to see a number of those recommendations reflected in the report that's been published today by the EV Energy Taskforce, and also reflected in the EV infrastructure strategy that was published last week. We very much see this as a start point, and one of the recommendations in today's report is around building on this knowledge. So this is a start point and something that we're going to be able to build on over time. So we've produced this one-page visual that will hopefully help people to understand that fleet is very diverse, that there are a number of different user groups and use cases. It identifies some of the challenges that those use cases will then face, and then we've been able to match those users against their preferred type of charging, but also show other types of charging that will be required. And I'll go into this in more detail. So starting with the user groups that we've put as needing at-home or work charging, we've put disabled users here. James just mentioned the fantastic work that's being done with the BSI standards, and I know Motability UK will speak later. They're doing some fantastic work with OZEV, which we fully support. But obviously for disabled users, accessibility is absolutely critical. So they are going to need to be able to charge at home or very, very close to home in most cases. We've also put company cars here. Company cars are very much leading the transition. All of the fleets that we spoke to as part of this research, it's the company cars that have been able to make that transition first of all. There are a number of reasons for that, but in a lot of cases it's because those company car drivers are able to easily charge at home or the workplace, and that's really helped with their decision to move to electric. We then have the at-depot-based use cases. And we've got two different types of users here. The first is delivery services, which is quite self-explanatory. People who are delivering groceries, parcels, etc. The other user group is quite a broad brush. So we've called it engineer work van. And this consists of users such as utility providers, recovery services, construction and site workers, and then the people that come into our homes to install, repair, maintain our central heating, our boilers and other household goods. So quite a broad brush. But what's common in a lot of these cases is the vehicle's not just there to take the driver from point A to B, but it also quite often will carry the tools that's required for that person to do the particular job in hand as well. When we look at the at-depot fleets, one of the key challenges that they need to overcome is where there's grid capacity issues. So this is where there's not enough power at that site for the charging infrastructure that they want to put in place. This can trigger what can be quite a complex and lengthy process and can also be extremely significant in cost. And in a lot of cases, that can slow the transition. A couple of interesting observations when we spoke to fleets. One was that a number of fleets that had a depot-based model, because of the pandemic and more people having to work from home, there were quite a large number of fleets who had moved away from more of a depot-based model and whose vehicles were then being taken home by the drivers at the end of the day, and I'll come on to that in just a moment. One of the other interesting observations with one fleet in particular that we spoke to was they had quite aggressively been rolling out depot-based infrastructure. But as the costs had started to mount, and also the fact that a lot of their drivers were still reliant on rapid charging infrastructure, public charging, because of the range of the vehicles, if they're on call, if they need to do top-ups, they'd actually taken a pause and were looking to see at how quickly public charging infrastructure was going to catch up, and whether that actually might be more of a viable solution than continuing with the costly upgrades to some of their depots. So just a couple of observations there that I think worth sharing. We've then got the large number of vans that are being taken home by the drivers. So this is where we've said that it's near home charging that's going to be a requirement. And what we mean by near home is anything within a sort of 5 to 10 minute walk of the driver's home. A lot of these drivers will not have off-street parking or a driveway where they're going to be able to charge. Normally, when we talk about people not being able to access off-street parking, I think the figures are around about a third of the population won't be able to do this. But actually, with commercial vehicles, we think that's likely to be far higher. British Gas have said a number of times that they anticipate that around 70% of their engineers will not be able to charge on a private driveway. Or even if they do have a driveway, it's likely that it's not going to be big enough for the van or that it's taken by the family vehicle. So we really do need to cater for these van drivers that take the vehicles home and don't have the ability to charge at home. So what's common with these? There's a couple of really significant challenges that we need to overcome. The first is security. So I mentioned the fact that the tools are on the van, and it's not just a case of being able to remove a toolbox. They're fully kitted out, so it's not just that you can take the tools off the vehicle. So security is going to be really important for these. In some cases where there are nearby car parks that would offer that security and the ability to park up securely overnight and charge, the issue is there's quite often height restrictions, so then there's real accessibility issues. Also, when we look at on-street charging, that's very much catering for cars. So quite often the spaces aren't long enough, the cables aren't large enough, the cables aren't long enough. So this presents a challenge as well around the accessibility of charging. Because of some of these issues, it's quite clear then that they are going to be very much reliant on public charging infrastructure at this point in time, and are looking at rapid charging that they can do within the working day, whether that's when they're taking their lunch break whilst completing paperwork or doing other tasks. And then the key issue that was raised by a number of fleets is that ability to roam and have some sort of fuel card equivalent. And fantastic to see that that's again been acknowledged within the government's EV infrastructure strategy. And then finally, we have the types of fleet that are going to be very heavily reliant on rapid charging. So I think rapid features in all of the other use cases as something that people are going to be requiring. But in this case, this is where the use cases are heavily reliant on rapid charging infrastructure. And that's because they have very limited downtime. So this includes things like your taxis, private hire, ride-hailing, car clubs, and also rental, who are all looking at rapid charging infrastructure, being able to, we've got car clubs who are taking the vehicles overnight, charging them and then delivering them back to the bays ready for people to use the next morning. Some of our rental members are looking at putting the infrastructure in at their rental branches, but again, this then triggers them into that whole grid capacity issue. And it's not just the operators themselves. If you're a customer and you're renting a vehicle and paying by the minute, the hour or the day, you do not want to sit for long periods of time charging the vehicle. So rapid's going to be equally important for the customers. And then in conclusion, there's 12 recommendations in the report that go across these 4 areas. I'm not going to go through them in any level of detail, but as I said, it's fantastic to see that these have been reflected in the report and the EV infrastructure strategy. I think the one comment I would make is it's really important that government, local, regional and national do engage with fleets. Fleets are very much the early adopters, and if we can get the charging infrastructure right for them and it cater for their needs and that we've got the right types of charging in the right places, that's going to see us through not just now but make sure that we've got a robust charging network that's suitable for everybody longer term as well. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. And I think, and again, it was reflected in the infrastructure strategy. The first thing we've got to do, and what we've heard from the user community, is actually work out what system we want to put in. And it's really important that we do that. As a resident of Milton Keynes, we were one of the first movers in plugged-in places back in, crikey, 2011. Someone from government will tell me, but back in 2011 or so, plugged-in places put charge points in the ground, and we probably now have one of the largest proportion of non-working charge points in the country. Certainly based on my personal experience. So I think, as we said, and you see the emphasis in the infrastructure strategy in terms of the key points that are coming out about making sure the system that we get is the right system for the users. It's got that accessibility, it's got those payment regimes, and it's got all of that capability built in to make the experience what we need it to be, and it's reliable. But of course, the headlines tend not to focus on that. The headlines always focus on how many. How many charge points do we need? When do we need them, and why? So that question was one of the ones that we within the task force had to grapple with, of course, as well. I'm fortunate that it wasn't my job to try and model any of that, and the experts and the team within the Energy Systems Catapult were tasked with putting together a model of the charge point numbers, types, networks that really would enable us to support the transition to the EV future. And I think it's really important that before you hear the numbers, you understand how that was put together, because when you look at the headlines, there are a very, very wide range of numbers out there, and we're going to add to that range today. But I think it's really important to understand the regimes and the assumptions behind those models, because they're all based on different assumptions. So I'm very pleased to introduce Talia Scoofer and Liam Lidstone to the platform to give us an insight in the modelling and the details behind that. Liam, I'm afraid, is not here with us today, so he will be online. I think he decided he'd be warmer at home, so tested positive for COVID. But Talia will be here, and we'll be taking some questions and answers afterwards. So Talia, I'll let you introduce Liam as and when. Thank you.
Great. Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, Liam is not here. I'm Talia Scoofer from the Energy Systems Catapult, and my job is to look after our transports, modelling capability and projects, and to lead this work that we've done for the task force. Do I click the next? We'll have a video of Liam.
Good afternoon.
That's a bit scary. Do we play the video?
So, to tackle this, the first step was to build consensus amongst the various stakeholders on the key assumptions, drawing on the in-depth know-how each brought to the table. This was then used to undertake the modelling, which we'll hear more about in a moment. And in turn, the outputs from this were then pored over by analysts and the task force's stakeholders, and ultimately helped inform the shared pathway and recommendations that will be discussed throughout the afternoon. In seeking to determine the charging infrastructure that will be required, the modelling has sought to balance several, often competing demands. Firstly, that there are enough charge points available, that they're the right type of charge point in the right places, and that drivers can see they're available, even during periods of high demand. That these charge points are investable, can sell enough electricity at a price that allows them to cover their costs and provide a return on investment, and be affordable for drivers, such that they encourage drivers to use them. The model used is Energy System Catapult's ESME Transport, which addresses these factors by not only looking at the crucially important vehicle, charge point and energy system technologies, but also travel patterns, consumer and fleet driver preferences, for example towards different types of vehicles, responsiveness to prices, as well as the effects of wider market and policy factors, and the impact on various commercial actors. A major focus of the work was around charge points. So just to explain which types have been covered and how they're classified. Both home and depot charging are included for those drivers that can access them, likewise for workplace charging. And then we have 4 types of public charging, which can potentially be used by any drivers. So for example, whilst someone with off-street parking might be able to do most of their charging at home, they would probably still need to use en route rapid charging on occasion, say on longer journeys, or make use of charging at retail locations from time to time. I should say these charge points have been classified from the perspective of the user and how they would fit their needs. Which brings me to the near-home charging. We've looked at 2 forms that research with consumers without off-street parking indicated were the most appealing to them. On-street residential or curbside charging, and rapid charging hubs in residential areas that drivers could quickly use near to where they live. And lastly, just before we get to the results, there are some important overarching assumptions we've used to make you aware of. The outputs are consistent with a longer term trajectory to net zero emissions by 2050. Likewise, UK energy generation and usage aligns with the sixth carbon budget. It's assumed that the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles end by 2030, and we've interpreted the 2035 date as applying similarly to plug-in hybrid cars and vans. Fuel cell vehicles, meanwhile, are assumed to enter the market once hydrogen from electrolysis is commercially available. Smart charging is assumed to be available at home charge points. Pricing at all charge points can be considered equilibrium pricing, so supply and demand are in balance and prices are stable. And charge points are deployed ahead of need to encourage uptake, but not too far ahead of need or saturating the market. So charge point operators can still gain a return on their investment over the lifetime of their own installations. So now I'd like to hand over to Thalia Scoofer to take you through some of the key insights from the modelling.
Perfect. Okay, so what I want to start with is obviously the characterization of that sweet spot in terms of charging infrastructure. But before we do that, want to touch a little bit more on the vehicle uptake and what really is driving the need for these charge points to be in place. And we looked at a number of cases with the modelling work. We went back to it. We changed our assumptions. We did lots of testing. But in every single case, what was very clear was that we would need to have these bold and aggressive rollouts if we want to meet both our short-term and long-term targets in terms of emissions, of sales of vehicles. And what it actually means is that we would need to have over 2 million BEVs sold in the UK if we want to have the electrification of the park and have that 75% of BEVs in the park by 2035. And the modelling outputs, what they show us is that not only we would need to have these restrictions in terms of emissions from the whole of the vehicle fleet, but it's also a combination of what the users want and how users would choose to move to an electric vehicle. So we're assuming and we're looking at vehicle prices falling, vehicle ranges increasing, and that means that it's much easier, like Catherine was talking about, commercial users, but private users as well, to be able to choose and move to an electric vehicle. So we're looking at the demand being there. We would need to have the supply of vehicles to be able to meet these targets and supply the vehicles to the market. And when looking at what it means in terms of sales, as I said earlier, if we look at the years after 2030, we would need to have more than 2 million vehicles sold annually, which is quite a big part of the global sales. So yes, we've got the vehicles on the market, we've got the vehicles in the park, what it means in terms of energy. And actually we're looking at the electricity demand from the vehicle park increasing up to 14% by 2035. So again, we would need to be able to have an electricity network that can support the electrification, can support the drivers. But obviously, we can't just look at transport in isolation. We need to look at everything else that is happening around that. So we're looking, for example, apart from the car and van sector, at other transport sectors, but also the electrification of heat and how actually the total annual demand is increasing between today and 2035, and that, as Philip was talking earlier, all the actions to be able to have the investment ahead of need, we would need to be able to support the total demand in multiple sectors that could be either competing or taking advantage of the same infrastructure. So we've got the demand up to 55 terawatt hours. Let's see what it means and where it is being delivered and what that system of charge points is. Liam talked a little bit about earlier about the different types. So we're going from the primary charging location, and we've got the majority of charging happening at home. in some cases, but then we've got users that can't charge at home, so we've got the near home charging, but also other forms of charging like the en route rapid and destination. And I'll start a little bit with home, because home was a little bit tricky. We looked at home at EV 1, but what we want to understand a little bit here is it's not what it means in terms of network, but what it means in terms of user prices as well. So what we can see here is we've got 3 tariff options. So we've got a flat rate tariff, which means that this is a standard domestic tariff. We've got time of use tariff that people can, it's the consumer's choice, they can charge when they have an incentive. And then we've got a more advanced tariff, where the control is basically delegated to a third party. Either that's an aggregator or an energy supplier, but actually they're controlling the charging when the right incentives are in place. And we tested that under different conditions. So we're going from just a flat rate tariff to only having the more advanced form of smart charging available. But what we can see is that even if we assume that we're going to a case where we've got a split and we've got users in both a flat rate tariff and a delegated control tariff, that means that everybody is benefiting from the smart charging in the system. So we can drop the charging prices from the 19p to the 17p. Okay. And now looking at the overall public network. So we're saying that 500,000 public charge points would need to be deployed. And that means that we need to move from actually just over 30,000 today to the 500 between up to 2035. And you can see there's this kind of like more aggressive rollout post-2025 to be able to meet the 2030 target in terms of ending the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles. But also you can see that the infrastructure will be diverse. And that is driven by users. It's driven by user needs, user requirements, and also the different kind of like behaviors that we see in terms of also charging, but traveling as well. So stopping a little bit to look at some of them in a little bit more detail. So en route rapid, we are making the assumption that this will be stable, and we've seen it over and over again in the modeling. En route rapid will be needed to support these longer journeys, and will be needed to support both commercial and private drivers. So the number of charge points is directly linked with vehicle uptake. The more vehicles, more charge points, simply because there's always going to be the demand and it will be stable. And if you look at it in terms of number of charge points, actually en route rapids don't take up as much of the proportion, but when we look at the energy demand, en route rapids can take up to 66% of the demand. So it's quite a big chunk of energy served through en route rapid charge points. Following on to near home, and that was an area that we really wanted to focus and understand in a lot more detail, because we talk a lot about people that can charge at home. We talk a lot about fleet vehicles and how they're going to use en route rapid stations, but we haven't really looked into detail about what happens for those that cannot charge at home. And we had a lot of debates throughout the EVET work, but we also decided to do some more work and engage with the users, engage with those that cannot, they're not able to charge at home. And what we've seen is that actually their kind of like preference is split. So we've got certain users, especially people that are using EVs today, that they're happy to charge on the street. But we also have users, especially those that are not considering to buy an EV at the moment, that they would prefer and would want to have that kind of like rapid charging experience. So we're seeing that actually a solution that looks like a a rapid hub station close to home that fleet users can use as well, has some uptake. So we decided to include that in the modeling and understand a little bit what the split would need to be like. So what we have in our central case, where we assume that people that don't have access to off-street parking, around 65 of them would still want to charge on street, but the rest would want to have the rapid charging hub experience. Have that, and as you can see, the numbers are quite different. So we've got about just over 200,000 on-street charge points, but we also have 4,000 local rapid charge points placed at local rapid hubs. As I said, the choice is driven by consumer preferences, but if we want to look at it in a little bit more detail, and if we want to look at it from the kind of like local area perspective, we would still need to do quite a lot of work. We would still need, like Philip was mentioning earlier, to have these local area energy plans and to understand other factors like availability of land, for example, for a hub, or availability of space for an on-street charge point, network reinforcement requirements, and other things that we could also factor in to the decision between a local rapid hub or an on-street charge point. And looking into this, we also wanted to look and understand a little bit what are the differences in terms of investment, in terms of charging prices that users will see in these two locations. And what we found and what was evident from the modeling was that when we've got higher throughput, we can actually have and see lower charging prices for users. And this, in simple terms, means that we would need to have enough vehicles to use them, but we would also need to manage the occupancy times. So we would need to manage the time that vehicles would be at a charge point and during charge time, but also after that as well. And it's clear from the graphs here that actually, if we want to double the occupancy time and go from our standard and what we used in our central case, 5-hour occupancy, to go even up to 12-hour occupancy time, that would have a detrimental effect on the number of charge points, but also on the charging prices. And this is an average, so it's a combination of longer times overnight, but also it accounts for shorter charging events during the day. So we go from if we double, or if we go up to the 12-hour occupancy time, we go from about 200,000 charge points even to up to 800,000. It's a big difference, and actually, because we've got these longer times that vehicles are occupying charge points, that would reflect on the prices, and that would shoot up prices quite a lot. And having that in mind, the effect of the throughput to the charging prices that users will see, we can see a comparison here between the local rapid hubs and the on-street residential charge points as well. So here it's kind of like a worked example of going from the number of charge points to the energy that they would serve to throughput, and then leading up to the price. And you can see that for the local rapid hubs, where we could have the higher throughput simply because users will be there for about half an hour. So you could have a higher turnaround. They could serve, even with these numbers, they would serve less energy, but the throughput would be much higher, therefore reflecting that into the prices seen by consumers. And like Liam was explaining earlier, in a mature market where we've got the equilibrium pricing, and we could see that convergence between prices at local rapid hubs and home charging if we assume our flat rate tariff. So that's quite a good example to help us understand a little bit what would drive investment and what users will see at these charge points, but also what kind of support we would need to give. And I know that the first question after this would be, have you actually considered smart charging on street? And it's the first point here on the future work. So no, we haven't considered it yet. It's in our mind. It's something that we want to try and understand the impact a little bit better, but also trying to understand how we manage the longer occupancy times with the availability of smart charging on street. Along that, there's quite a big list here. I'm not going to go through everything, but enhancing a little bit and understanding in more detail the fleet travel patterns, and like Catherine was mentioning earlier, where fleets would want to choose and charge, and how maybe they would change their model away from just depot charging. It's part of the work that we're proposing on doing next. Enhancing a little bit our model of on-street residential and local rapid hubs to understand what other revenue streams might be in place that could affect the charging prices. Also, alternatives, either that's peer-to-peer charging or workplace charging for people, again, that cannot charge at home. But also implementing, as well as the more advanced smart charging tariffs that we've got, implementing vehicle to grid, again, to understand the impact on the consumer, the network, and the charging infrastructure. And I see the last one, the one before last, the impact of future battery technologies is kind of like a continuous improvement. As the vehicle technology is progressing and changing, we really want to reflect that back into our assumptions in the modeling, because we're going from vehicles to kind of like energy demand to then be able to characterize the charging infrastructure network. We need to understand how these future battery technologies could affect the types of charge points and the numbers of charge points that we would need to have in place. And the final one is about competitive pricing and price elasticity, which again, it's a kind of like a feedback loop that we haven't implemented in the model yet. And again, we need to look at that in a little bit more detail to be able to provide some more kind of like deeper analysis on the offerings for near home charging solutions. And I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Talia. We will take a few minutes for a few questions for Talia. We started 10 minutes late, so I'm going to cut into coffee break by 10 minutes. So we'll open the floor for a couple of questions, but if I may, I'm a simple engineer, but I do love to dig into the details. And what I would say, both the OZEV strategy and indeed the SMMT's infrastructure plan that was published in February, I credit both of them with real transparency about the numbers. But when I look at those, they have quite a lot lower numbers of vehicles required. So we've got a very high uptake of vehicles, I think actually almost double some cases. So we're looking at 15 million vehicles in 2035, 26 million, yeah, in 2035. So the numbers are in there. Yeah. My point, if you like, is the geeky engineer. I'm also an EV driver. What sort of utilisation are we talking about on the charge points with this model? Because quite frankly, it's the queue that I get when I get to the charge point that worries me. And if I'm looking at 100% utilisation, that's going to worry me. But what does this manifest itself to the user like me?
Okay, I'll give you a long answer to your simple question. But the assumption that we're making is that users would be able to access charge points even at times of peak demand. So we look at our busiest time of the day, and we assume that users would still be able to access a charge point at that time of the day, if that makes sense. But without then, because we talked about affordable, investable, and accessible charging infrastructure. At the same time, we need to keep utilization at such level that would make a return on the operator's investment. So it's meeting that kind of like convergence between these criteria, between being able, users like you, to be able to access a charge point without having a queue, without also having 10,000 empty charge points. I'm making up the number, but yeah, without having empty charge points that are sitting there unused and unoccupied as well. But we're not talking about 100% utilization, and we're not talking about unrealistic numbers. If you think.
So our central number within our central case was 500,000.
Yeah.
And within that, I don't have to worry about Uber coming in with some sort of surge pricing process that's going to price me out of the market because it's a bit busy just down the road from me.
No.
Excellent. That's what I wanted to hear. So I'm confident in my EV driving. Anybody else got any questions for Talia and the team? Crikey, we've got quite a few here. I will start over here. So the lady at the front here in the red, there's a microphone coming.
Hi, Jo Wall from Local Partnerships. Talia, the one thing that struck me as slightly counterintuitive was the suggestion that the pricing in local rapid hubs could be half that of the on-street infrastructure. I think that would be a real concern for local authorities who might end up providing a lot of that on-street infrastructure that it won't get properly used. So I just wanted to understand the rationale for that, because my running assumption is that whilst those might be more profitable, that rather than dropping prices, it was more likely that the operators would just look to make more profit.
Good question, and it's something that when we started the work, it was the way we were thinking as well. But what the model does, and the prices that you see are output, so we haven't decided and we haven't inputted to the model those prices. And I think it goes back to the point of assuming that we're at a mature and competitive market, and actually we're reflecting the throughput that I talked about, and we're reflecting the higher usage into the prices that users would see. So it's reflecting that. It's the link between having the availability, the ability to make money from a charge point operator's point of view, to be able to reflect that into the prices and be in that competitive and mature market.
Thank you, Talia. I'll take the gentleman just behind there next, since the microphone's close. That's
hi, I'm Stuart Cook. I'm involved in a lot of private debt financing of charging infrastructure. Just also a bit of a basic question, but we've struggled on some of the deals we've looked at with just the variability of assumptions over a 10 or 15-year period. I mean, if you're out on those assumptions, it has a massive effect. How do you deal with, I mean, you talk about central cases, and I obviously appreciate you're modelling experts, and I'm not, but how do you deal with that massive potential variances on assumptions in an exercise like this?
It's the reason why we wanted to run several cases, to be able to also not just look at the range in the assumptions, but also understand the impact they would have on the outputs. Because in some cases you might vary numbers quite a lot, but actually what comes out is not affected that much, or the effect is not significant. And what has the biggest effect in terms of charge point numbers is how people would use charge points, where they would choose to charge, but also how they travel. So travel patterns would have the greatest effect on the number of charge points. And it's something that, yeah, it was quite evident from the work that we've done, that we need to really understand how people would use vehicles in the future to be able to have more confidence in what any modelling tells us.
So just building on that a little bit, and it was one of the things that I mentioned to us. So we've traditionally looked at the number of vehicle sales as being one of the metrics we all track. Are there some new metrics that we and policymakers should be keeping an eye on that will help us understand whether we are on the pathway for the right number of charges in the right place at the right time? Is vehicle sales the be all and end all? Is vehicle miles travelled? Is it energy? Where's the biggest sensitivities in the modelling?
Vehicle sales, yes, it's quite important. Overall size of the park as well, and travelling, commuting types of journeys as well. We've seen and tested a little bit in the modelling work the effect of having shorter journeys instead of having longer journeys. So that's also another factor we need to look at. Also, miles driven by commercial vehicles and where these vehicles travel to as well.
Sounds like the data team need building up within DFT. I think that's the key. Let's take another question. We'll take on that side, and I will come over to this side in a moment. Just a second.
Thanks very much for that presentation. I'm Zach from EV Serious. So it took me quite a bit of research to find this, but at its peak there were roughly 45,000 petrol stations, sometime around the 50s, and today there's roughly 8,500. But in real terms, those 8,500 forecourts have 33,000 pumps, and that becomes 66,000 nozzles that are servicing cars. And there are roughly 35 million cars in the UK on the road. And that's approximately a ratio of 500 cars to each nozzle. Now, what's really interesting when one looks at how do we plan for the future with EVs, what's very different is that, you know, from your numbers up there, there are going to be 15 million home chargers servicing cars. Today, there's no one who has a petrol station at home. So that completely changes the dynamic, because the number of people who should be leaving their home with a car full will be extremely high, because that'll be the cheapest energy. So my question is, how much caution is there when there is planning for hundreds of thousands of public charging points, and there will be potentially millions in people's homes? And, you know, going back to this number, there's 500 cars to every nozzle in the UK. So if we think about that in terms of a demand from a public side, what does that actually then do for those kind of numbers that you've put into in your study and report?
I think that's fundamentally what the modelling has done, is look at exactly how that works.
Yeah.
So we've transferred to, I haven't got the numbers in front of me, but the fleet in 2035 was about 75% BEV, I think.
Yeah.
So that transition of the fleet with that model and those assumptions delivers that number of charging points as the requirement.
So the logic flow, if you want, is what system restrictions we've got in terms of emissions. Would people want to buy electric vehicles, to then understand how these people would travel and what that equate to in terms of energy demand, to then say, if we want to serve this energy demand, but we also want the network to be affordable, investable, and accessible, we would need to have these up to 500,000 charge points in place.
But again, you're going to have potentially up to 15 million home charging points. I mean, even today, we have more home charging points than we have nozzles for fossil fuels. So it's just sometimes people get scared by very large numbers, and they make something sound like it's impossible and harder to achieve, when really, if one might look at it from another perspective, with so many cars leaving topped up at the beginning of the day or running their errand, it has to change the dynamic on what the demand is. And I guess my other question is, when you're looking at your energy assumption, are you using the energy assumption that today is from, you know, hydrocarbons that goes into a car, as it translated then, you know, on a one-on-one ratio? No. Okay, so it's taking into account the energy efficiency of an electric.
Exactly.
We've been doing this a
and
while.
Also
So.
the types of vehicles that will be on the road in the future, improvements in battery efficiency, for example, and so on, sizes of batteries as well. We're accounting for the evolution of the vehicles as well.
Yeah.
I'll take some questions over there. I think I will, great point to just shout out that actually I've got 2 charge points that appear to be in use all of the time, but sharing charge points, sharing cars and travel overall is a whole thing that overlays this. And I think Joel's here, you know, the opportunity to share charge points and use smart digital has to be one of the things we look at with those 15 million identified home ones. Let's take a question over this side of the room. I'll take the gentleman here. Sorry, I didn't realise I had 2 mics. I thought we had to run it round. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. My name's John Rainford. I'm from Jolt. So, and I saw it on the presentation there. I'm just wondering what's driving this proliferation of 22 kilowatt AC in the UK, because we're established in the US, Australia, New Zealand, the UK. The UK is the only place we're really seeing this. And I could see on your slides that you were saying 22 kilowatt AC makes sense in an office location and a destination, when it's always the vehicle that determines what rate those cars charge at on AC. So in my little Nissan Leaf, 6.6 kilowatt AC, if I rock up at a 22 kilowatt AC charger, it is pointless. And I'm seeing it more and more. People are thinking that it will charge the car about 3 times faster, and it's not the case. I'm wondering if there's something we can do about that. And the conversations we're having with the OEMs, they're not increasing this AC capacity. So we're just going to have loads of stranded 22 kilowatt AC assets.
So that was an agreed assumption going into the modelling, and it was driven mainly by the cost of a 7 kilowatts and a 22 kilowatt charge point. Also a little bit on the future proofing as well. We've had some feedback that people that are providing workplace or depot charging, they would want to future proof their investment and go for the 22 kilowatt today instead of wait.
But it's not really future-proofing, because the AC charging capacity is designed for single-phase electricity in a domestic property, and the maximum that could ever be is about 7 kilowatts. And that's where the AC market sits. I mean, the only exception is the Renault Zoe, and that's a legacy issue on that. It's just that...
Yeah, I think a large number of some of them are coming out with 11 kilowatt AC typically on board at the moment. So I think that's typically where a lot of the vehicles are running right now. So I think that future-proofing is one of the aspects. So yeah, I mean it's a valid point. It's certainly one that's been raised in terms of what those charge points are actually used for, without a doubt. Yeah.
Because we need to break, we just need to break that link. In the UK, we seem to think it's the charging point manufacturers that are going to determine what speed the vehicles charge at, and that is never going to be the case.
No.
Any other an eager question? Oh, sorry. We'll take this one down the front, and I will then take the one at the back. So I'll take this gentleman here in the front. Yes.
Well, you're very brave to put numbers, but when the price of energy has exploded, did you fix these points at a certain price a year ago or something? Because
no.
they look a bit strange to me, some of these numbers.
So, good point, and thanks for asking, actually. It's a good point to clarify. We haven't fixed the prices, and the modelling work was done prior to the prices going up. The analytical framework that we're using goes from total system demands and also total system generation. So it looks at all these technologies that would be required to generate electricity in the UK, and then translating that into wholesale electricity prices. So the prices you see here are obviously a factor of several things. One of them is wholesale electricity prices, and these are an output of our national modelling capability. That's why the increase in retail prices has not been factored in.
So the thing that just occurred to me, looking at your figures, was this not that much price difference between the different, on one of your charts, the time of day, for instance, and the ratio of prices, sort of 17 down to 16 pence, didn't seem right to me. It certainly doesn't represent what's available on the market at the moment, when you can get a ratio of, say, 3 to 1.
And the prices are an average price average across the year, so it accounts for obviously much lower prices in certain time periods, but also higher prices in other periods as well. So it's an average. It's not an instantaneous hourly price.
I think, yeah, and it's modelled quite a long way forward in a very mature market, and we're not in that same maturity.
Well, I understand that, and I'm not going to hold the microphone very much longer at all. My understanding is we're basically moving in a big way towards wind power. Wind power is going to be very plentiful, but not find much use overnight. So surely those prices are going to be dramatically different. And indeed, the open market has delivered negative pricing under these conditions historically, sometimes.
It has occasionally, and that's obviously what the Minister referred to. Negative pricing, I'm not sure that will continue significantly. I'll take the final question there, but just a very politic reminder. These prices are based on reading your meters today, by the way, so I would get that in because it may go up tomorrow. But yes, we'll take the question.
Thank you very, very much, Tom Packenen from ChargeLight. Just to put my cards on the table, we install electric vehicle charge points in lampposts. And just picking up on the comment from the lady who asked the first question, commenting on how significant this finding could be for decisions made by local authorities as to where they invest the, well, central government and their own funds and actually private sector funds in the next few years. My question is around models and validation of models, because the numbers you presented around the difference between local rapid hub charging and on-street residential charging are completely reverse to what we think and what a lot of people in the sector think. And I just wondered who you'd spoken to about the numbers and who you validated it with before publishing, see kind of testing it and seeing how there might be some areas for exploring them further.
Yeah, so it was the EVET steering group and EVET members that were helping and actually making decisions along the way as well. So from deciding and agreeing these all the inputs that went into the model, and then looking at the outputs along the way, and the rationale behind the outputs as well.
I think it's a great point, Tom, and in the detailed report you'll see different scenarios, and that, you know, and one of the key messages is about trying to identify in different areas what the right solution is, because it may well be that in some areas, you know, a greater proliferation of street lamppost charging actually works for that community. So this is the problem with a single number, which is why we've been trying to be quite careful. Maybe I completely undermine that care by blurting out the number of 500,000. But you know, the fact is, these are ranges, and we are in a very, very evolutionary, and we're trying to understand, and that's the key thing I think that comes out through the strategies in our work, is about really understanding, really drilling into this, and trying to put the right charges in the right places at the right time. But that is still a work in progress in defining what right is. I think my point, and you know, was that more isn't always right. But it can be that well, more is certainly what we need, but more of what is the right solution. So I'm going to wrap things up there. Apologies, because I know certainly if you're like me, you're looking for a cup of coffee now, and we will come back for a couple of panel sessions later on to wrap up. Thank you very much. I'll aim to come back in 20 past, so we'll take 10 minutes out as well. But thank you very much, Tyler.
I must admit, I saw some large queues gathering at the cloakroom, and I was a bit worried that people were voting with their feet, but it turns out a lot of people were getting their coats on because... and I'm not going to say anything particularly unpleasant about how surprising it is the Institute of Mechanical Engineers can't quite manage the mechanics of a heating system. But anyway, but I've said it, so there we are. With that said, we're now going to go a little bit deeper into some of those thorny questions that will be beginning to be exposed in the Q&A around the modelling outputs. In the first instance, what we're going to be touching on is the whole dilemma around investability and the trade-offs that may or may not be around the question of what might be investable, what might not be investable, and the consequences in terms of business model, pricing, and so forth that we've seen earlier. So, to help us with that, it's great to welcome back Katie. So Katie will join us from OZERV. We have with us Lauren Pammer from the Green Finance Institute, and Roy Williamson, who some of you might know because in the past he was in charge of advanced mobility at BP, so very much involved in BP getting into EV charging in the first place through the ChargeMaster acquisition. But now, but BP Pulse as is, yeah. But now, as of, I think, today or yesterday? Tomorrow. Tomorrow has just been appointed to be the chair of Recharge in Norway, which is fantastic. So, and Joe Wall from Local Partnerships. So if you wouldn't mind coming up here and sitting kind of along here somewhere, we'll have a bit of a conversation. I'm just going to get things rolling with a couple of questions, partly because I wanted to reflect a little bit on some of the topics that came out in the Q&A with Talia earlier, and then we'll open it up to everyone to see whether or not you have got any questions that you'd like to ask of our distinguished panelists. So, one of the things that clearly emerged in the response to the to the modelling outputs was this question around the apparent counterintuitive finding that pricing at a rapid hub, which we assume to be much more expensive, is looking like in a competitive, mature, balanced market, on average, all those caveats applying, right, is looking to be more cheaper than it is for a longer duration 7 kilowatt curbside charge point. And that, in part, of course, is a function of the way that the model looks at investment returns. And I just wondered whether or not there was benefit in unpacking that a little bit. And I know that Lauren and Roy, you've both been involved to an extent in thinking through some of these questions, and then seeing how that lands with Katie and Joe. So do you want to start with that?
Sure, I'll have a go. It's not easy. My experience over the last year or 18 months has been actually working with some of these investors, so both on the private equity side, on the venture capital side, and obviously in BP from a corporate perspective. And each of those investors looks at things actually quite differently and has different risk profiles in what they're prepared to invest in. And a lot of that, as you get to the bigger investors, if you like, the private equity infrastructure funds in a much more mature market, technology risk is out of the picture. You need to be looking at pretty secure demand. You need to be looking at sort of secure levels of utilization and to be pretty clear about the cost base. And this is where I think, Tom, some of your comments around, when one puts that into a model, what's very clear is that utilization is the key driver of profitability. So you need to be driving kilowatt hours through these machines, kilowatt hours delivered by these machines in order to make sense of any investment model. And you can see that right across the picture. You either do that by fast charging, rapid deployment of kilowatt hours through faster machines and higher numbers of vehicles coming through, with quite a high denominator in terms of cost, the 50 kilowatt, the 150 kilowatt, the 350 kilowatt chargers. Or you do that locally and in the residential charging with realistically 1 or 2 vehicles charging every day, which can only be 40 or maybe 60 or maybe 80 kilowatt hours delivered in a day. And if you do the maths on that local residential charging, you either have to price it very high or you have to get to a cost for that, which is very low. Because frankly, you know, if you think about, I don't know, 30 pence a kilowatt hour, 40 kilowatt hours a day, you're into the sort of, even if you did 365 days a year, you'd be into the sort of $4,000 a year revenue level, which is just not sustainable if you're putting £2,000–3,000 worth of kit in, or even more. And that's, I think, where Thalia's model has come out, is that, and the response of the model to that is, okay, you need to price it higher to get that return. And obviously, that's not how it will be priced, because slow charging in residential areas simply cannot be more expensive than a 15-minute charge in an ultra-rapid site. So the economic challenge, Phil, if I can put it that way, is to either get the cost down, and that's maybe, you know, Tom, where you come in with very cheap lamppost charging or some similar alternative, or find a government support mechanism that would enable that local residential charging. Does that make sense?
And I think that's what we've seen to date, is we've seen a lot of grant funding going into local on-street residential charging, and that's helped keep the prices low, and also very long-term contracts. So what we are seeing is charge point companies need much longer-term contracts, 10, 15 years plus, in order to make the return on investment in lamppost charging and in on-street charging. I think the other bit the model hasn't yet built in is the fact that actually these rapid charging hubs are earning other revenues. So they've got a coffee shop, or they've got something else where you've extended the dwell time and you're walking in and you're spending £10 more in Tesco's because your car's charging, or they've got advertising revenues. So I think the model itself is very stark, and I think massive kudos to Talia and Liam, because I know we went through an awful lot of iterations of it and a lot of challenge, and a lot of work went into that. But I think that's very much what it would look like on paper, nothing else happening. That, you know, the reality is there will be other things that go on that mean the pricing is more reflective of how you see it today in the real world.
And so, Joe, to what extent is this creating a potential dilemma as you start to think about the rolling out of infrastructure in, you know, across the country in local authorities everywhere?
I think there's two things. The first thing I would say is that I think the model's really interesting. It doesn't necessarily reflect what will actually happen on the ground in terms of competition. So those rapid hubs won't necessarily have a natural competitor in the local area. So you can't necessarily assume that whilst they could deliver the power at 22p kilowatt hour, that they actually will. So I think there's a tension in that. In terms of the deployment of public infrastructure, one of the really key concerns for local authorities is a just transition. Yep. And actually power being available in the poorest communities for charging. And I think they would look with some horror at that model, to be honest with you, because what that's actually saying is in a lot of those communities, because they're the ones that are less likely to attract a rapid hub, or those where there is less power available, that you're starting to see communities that potentially could be ransomed. Local authorities themselves are quite nervous about investing in on-street charging for a number of reasons. One of them is around whether they're actually going to have to provide ongoing revenue support and whether or not those charges will ever be viable. And there are other concerns around length of contracts and if they're not that lucrative, whether or not that equipment will be properly maintained and serviced. So it's kind of playing right into the fears that you see in the sector already. So that is a bit of a worry.
Okay. So I was sort of grasping at some straws of hope in some of the modelling, in that, you know, I share all of the concerns around, you know, someone living in a nice suburban environment with their third Tesla, and Octopus paying them to charge overnight, and someone who's in much less advantaged circumstances paying, you know, potentially 30 to 40 to 50 pence a kilowatt hour to be able to charge at all. That feels like a really difficult dilemma. And so the hope that I was seeing in the modelling was the prospect with some public charging formats that there was at least economic potential for that differential to diminish. But you're warning us against how that might play out in competitive reality in specific locales.
That would be my instinct, is that it won't necessarily play out that way. And that if we're going to direct public subsidy into the sector, what we probably should be doing is directing that into owning the infrastructure below the ground. So that what plugs on the top of it is what's in the market and has to provide return on investment, but what actually provides the long-term infrastructure. Because if you're talking about long-term returns and long-term contracts, actually a lot of that cost goes in the ground. And if you can change the provider on a plug-and-play basis without, you know, with the local authority retaining control, for example, of the grid connection and things like that, you're in a very different place commercially than you are if you push all of that into the industry to deliver, and then you may be locked into a 15 or 20-year contract that may or may not work for local residents. It's fair to say on-street parking is actually quite contentious, and there were speakers earlier that were sort of saying, oh yeah, you know, I think it'd be great. Actually, at the moment, if you're in areas where it's difficult to park anyway, and you put dedicated EV charge bays in, and you haven't got any EVs, again, that's something else local authorities are worried about. So it's about, in the same way you need to create investor confidence in the market, you kind of need to create that same sort of confidence with local government as to how we're going to help allay their issues.
What a segue.
Katie.
I mean, I recognise a lot of what Joe is saying, and I think the thing that I think the model produces a very interesting theoretical result. It is counterintuitive, and that's why it's interesting to sort of unpick and explore at what's driving it. I think what would be worrying is if people picked it up and starting making decisions about charge point provision and what it should look like based on that, because I think it's, for me, I see it's an interesting, thought-provoking result that sparks a really interesting conversation, but we are a very long way off from knowing how it will actually play out. So I think it's important how we present and sort of talk about it, because I don't think we'd want local authorities to pick it up and use it to decide what the charge point mix should be.
Well, and one of the other themes that came out from the debate that was sparked by sharing, and, you know, of course, that's the whole point of models, right? It is absolutely to shed insight and provoke debate around areas that, you know, perhaps, you know, people might have been holding a question over, but seeing numbers and things, it really starts to bring to life. So I thought it was really interesting. Often I hear people talk about the need to have almost ubiquitous charging availability if we're to overcome reticence on the part of EV drivers to purchase a car in the first place. We heard a really interesting pushback that said, compared with you know, fuels retailing, you know, it feels like even the numbers that we've put up there, even frankly the government number for 2030, feels like, you know, sort of a mad excess of charging. We've also been talking about the importance of utilization times price to give a return, and we know that we're going to have to unlock private investment at a much greater scale, regardless of what numbers you're charging at, if we're going to be able to deliver the kind of infrastructure that we're talking about. How should we, or how might we go about squaring this circle, and ideally avoid falling into some of the potential, you know, lock-ins or local monopoly traps that Joe was warning us against? So I'd be how are you thinking about this, Lauren?
So you're right, we need a lot more private investment in charging infrastructure. So we put out a report last year that said you need about £20 billion worth of investment in charging infrastructure by 2030. Obviously the government have put in 1.6 billion so far, which is great, but you're clearly going to need a lot more money. So how can we use the government funds very cleverly and smartly to crowd in more private investment and therefore save the government money for the areas that it's really needed, which could well be in that on-street charging in certain locations where it's needed for societal good. I think in terms of then accessing that money, what we found is there's a number of barriers that private finance are saying exists at the moment. One of them is data and actually accessing the data that will tell them what the utilisation will be at those charge points to know if it is an investable opportunity or not. So I think anything we can do to make access to data more readily available, particularly around utilisation of charge points and the historic utilisation and predicted utilisation into the future. Clearer advanced sight of grid connection costs as well, because that's one of the big numbers, the connection to the grid and the reinforcement that's needed that can really blow a business case out of the water, and that number can be anything between £10,000 and a couple of million, depending on exactly whereabouts in the road that charging point is going to go. And actually, if it went on another side of a building, that meant you didn't have to dig out the car park, it could be a completely different number. And then also government policy and funds, and how the sort of longevity of that policy really de-risks that investment. So how can investors understand what the future roadmap is of charging infrastructure and get themselves comfortable that they're not going to have stranded assets if they invest now, and that they're investing ahead of need, but not so far ahead of need that you're left with redundant assets in 5 years' time that are rusting and need replacing, like it sounds like they do in Milton Keynes.
So, longer contracts, more data, better planning, more transparency. Is that sufficient in thinking about managing the investment risk and investment confidence in the ramp up to the sunlit uplands that perhaps the model was representing, where we've been through the pain of transition and we're in a relatively balanced supply-demand environment?
Yeah, I think broadly, yes, for those use cases where there is some profitability in the long-term horizon. And I think there are people that are prepared to go in and invest 10 years, 15 years forward. I think the challenge comes, and by the way, the market transparency, the perfect market, the information, all that stuff helps enormously, as well as you say, Joe, the underground support. And many of the barriers are actually non-financial. So a lot of what came out from the GFI report was the policy issues, the license issues, the planning applications, all that stuff. That was getting in the way. And certainly from my experience working with some of those investors, they wanted to turn the dial up on speed of deployment. And there would be people from the top of these organizations screaming, come on. And the operators just could not make it happen. And in this market, it's difficult. In some other markets, in Sweden, for example, it can take 18 months from the time you decide to deploy a charger to actually deploying a charger. It's not, fortunately, as bad as that in the UK generally, but it's still way, way too long. So there's a sensitivity there. I think the challenge will be where, and for me, this is the local residential stuff, the rural markets where, frankly, the utilization won't be there, and it's all about, as you say, Phil, utilization this. That's where I think government need to step in and help, and there are some creative ways of doing that, and we came up with some of those in our report. But I do think there is a role for government intervention on where demand simply cannot justify investment. But I think in 80% of the times, the government just needs to step out of the way and let the market compete and provide the standard structure and all the stuff that's doing. I think we would support everything that's in your strategy because it makes perfect sense.
And local authorities have some concerns, but also have a big role to play in helping, or it would seem from what Lauren and Robin saying, have a big role to play in helping clear away some of these non-financial obstacles and increasing the sort of the flash to bang time on an investment, or not, Joe?
I mean, I think it's fair to say, local authorities, they're the local place shapers, and they understand the nature of where they are better than any other organisation, and they are clearly well placed to be the ones that actually own some of that strategy. Understanding what's happening in the market and some market transparency really helps with that, and sometimes that's a bit opaque in terms of who's doing what and where. There's no point in putting infrastructure in where the you're talking about crowding in private sector investment. Actually, we kind of need to do this together so we all understand actually what's going to happen in the market and what's not. And there are some concerns about actually how you do that. But actually the local area energy planning piece is clearly something that should sit fair and square between the DNOs and the local authorities.
Yeah.
And it isn't just transport, it's equally it's heat. And it's not locking in problems now. For example, we're still building houses that are not to a passive standard and are going to require heat pumps. Why on earth are we doing that? Bearing in mind how stressed the network is going to be with the additional transport requirements. We're making people put charge points in, but we're actually still allowing them to plan for a heat pump when actually they could do relatively cost-effective energy efficiency work now that wouldn't stress the network in the same way. So there's lots of things there. In terms of planning and processes, I will touch on that briefly because as a former renewable energy developer, I would say this industry is just feeling the pain that the renewables industry has been feeling for the last decade in terms of processes that simply don't work well together and timings that don't work well together, standard statutory timescales to turn around grid offers, how you manage those when you've got them, and the planning framework. At the end of the day, for a local authority to actually change its planning policy is a lengthy process. It's a statutory process, and it's not something that's actually in their gift to turn around and go, oh, we could just. Arguably, that might be better done through the National Planning Policy Framework than by trying to get each and every local authority to change some of that. But then you get also into all of the highways concerns and the highway regulation. So there's a lot of regulation in this industry that kind of, it's not easy to move it.
Yeah. So we touched on the support you've managed to unlock in the strategy, which is critical. So I think there are two clear questions here, right? One is the extent to which there is a recognition in government of or an openness to consider mechanisms to think about risk mitigation or risk sharing, particularly in the provision of capacity in low utilization environments as part of giving equity and equality of access. And the second is how best to encourage and support the better connection of awful pun of these discordant planning processes and regulatory processes that are clearly an issue for lots of people.
Yes, and there's a lot there, isn't there? I think what the sort of shift we're starting to mark in the new EV infrastructure strategy is this really trying to focus on parts of the market that aren't mature or will never, where the commercial case will never stack up, as opposed to market stimulation. And I think that firstly, there are two particular use cases, so rapid en route, as we've said, and on street, where we think require particular government potential for particular government intervention. But equally, we want to crowd in as much private sector investment as possible. So, for example, the current on-street rapid charge point scheme upfront funds 75% of the capital cost of charge points that local authorities want to put in. And we think that in a lot of areas that's already too generous. So we want to shift towards supporting larger scale projects and really just government putting in what it needs to put in and crowding in as much as possible from the private sector. So there is that sort of working together and working very closely with the local authority to make sure that the plan for an area stacks up. I've lost my, what's the second part of the question? The planning stuff.
Yeah.
So all the stuff, so again, as Joe says, as you would expect, we have quite a lot of conversations about barriers, particularly some of the planning issues with lots of people across government. And we are feeding into some of these things that need to be changed. It's not fast, and as Joe says, it's not EV specific either. There's a whole host of issues across other industries, across all the other things that we need to do to achieve decarbonisation, and electric vehicles is really starting to come across that, and so it's important that we get the balance right between really trying to fix things for us, but also getting it right for the other things that are coming along behind us.
Yeah, I mean the conviction that many of us have that, you know, if we get EV infrastructure right, it'll make so much of the rest of the energy transition much more straightforward. If we screw it up, then the chances are we're going to make 2050 really, really hard work in the other things. So, right, so has anyone got any questions they would like to raise with the panelists in the general theme of investment, investability, and getting the network we need when we need it? I'm going to give you a second bite of the cherry in a minute. Gentleman at the back there.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. I'm a travel journalist, academic in tourism. One of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is the whole area of sustainable tourism and greening destinations. Thus far, I've not heard any part of the overall equation here that addresses these issues at all. If you take Westminster, where I work and live, we have vehicle saturation basically from spring half term right the way through the summer months up until the end of October. So we know a little bit about that, but if you take two villages where I live, there are probably around about 78 properties which are into the rental market, but probably only 3 have an electric charging point.
And your question, therefore, is?
How does one address the rural dimension? I believe one of your chair members mentioned about rural just now, but how does the infrastructure seek to address the people who reside in the country and the tourism infrastructure?
We've been thinking about this in a couple of ways, actually. One for in terms of actually people who own rental properties and might be letting them out, you know, is there a product that means they could install a charger at that rental property, which then should allow them to charge more to the people who are travelling there because it's recognised as a benefit, and I think actually you do see that. There's also, Joel's giving me the eye, so there's, you know, there are solutions like co-charger, where again, properties like that, you know, if they're registering those chargers that can be shared then between community, because what you do find is that, you know, we're saying we need 15 million chargers, but those chargers might only be used once a week. So, you know, we need to do more sharing of chargers as well as more sharing of the cars themselves. But we're also looking at potential products that could be linked to utilisation. So some sort of loan where it's based on utilisation rate and repayments are based on utilisation. And that could work in a seasonal environment where you know, the revenues are obviously going to be higher during the summer, but less high out of season. But interestingly, one charging company we did speak to said that places like the Lake District is ideal for charging because the utilisation is so high during that peak season that it allows for the lower demand out of the season. But having said all that, you also don't want to encourage more people to drive into these areas just by installing charging infrastructure there, because that's not going to be great for congestion and everything else. So there's a much wider whole kind of systems approach to transport and public transport that's needed as well, I think. It's not an easy one to solve.
Thank you. Anything else?
I was going to add, I think, you know, tourism is one and the kind of rural bit, but I think there are a number of levers in that, you know, we've looked at new properties and we're starting to require new properties to provide charge infrastructure. There are other kind of levers in that sort of market that you could look to, and I'll touch on the tourism bit in a minute, but for example, where you've got leasehold residential property at the moment that has off-street parking, it's very difficult for tenants to get access to a charge point. So, you could, in the same way that you regulate for those tenanted properties to have to be at a certain energy efficiency level, you could either make it a tenant's right that they can install a charge point, that the landlord cannot object and cannot charge them to do so, or you could actually make it a requirement for a landlord that if they've got off-street parking, they have to provide it. In the same way, when houses are bought and sold, at the moment you have to do an EPC survey.
Yeah.
Actually, you could make it a requirement they have to install an EV charge point if they've got off-street parking. And those are kind of things that happen, they're lifetime events. In the scheme of the costs of things, they're not big costs. And you would slowly roll around quite a lot of properties that otherwise might be relatively slow to transition. In terms of the tourism market, I think the biggest thing there is actually about modal shift and encouraging people to travel to those areas much less by car and much more by other means of transport, and then providing car club vehicles and the like in the area that probably charge from community facilities that are available to those communities as well, rather than by encouraging people to take their own vehicle that way and charge it, because the roads in your part of the world and in mine, I live in Norfolk, are horribly congested for large parts of the year.
Right, so another question. Gentleman at the front.
My name is Ian Glasscock. I work for a startup, a UK startup. We're making EV chargers at a factory in Scotland. Hello. I haven't got the solution for this, but we all know what price we're currently paying for fuel, anyone who hasn't got an electric car. And I'm really asking people here that have got future influence, if we look ahead 10, 20 years, we don't want to be in a situation where Shell and BP have control of these networks, all due respect, but all of a sudden that kind of congestion of grid captivity creates a kind of a lock hold of what they can then charge us within our electric cars. Which is extortionate at the moment, and even more exacerbated by the tragedy that we're seeing within Ukraine. And from a startup perspective, I'm just kind of wondering that some of these big, huge conglomerates also find ways of very tax-efficient methods. Is there ways, and it's a question which I don't think you've got the answer, but I'm just kind of putting it out there to please find solutions and keep those discussions going, that startups and growing companies that employ people that pay tax at higher rates initially, but also provide many other benefits for an economy, especially when it's kind of localised, actually find solutions where there's really tax incentives, investment incentives. I know that the SEIS scheme and EIS schemes are very good, but it's very difficult, I think, for the layman person to kind of see the benefits of investing in those. But in some ways, if there are tax solutions, I know the VAT announcement last week has helped, but I think we need to kind of be looking ahead 10, 20 years when we have all of these charge points everywhere. We're then beyond, okay, where's the different energy sources are coming into, that there are really future-proofed methods that protect us as the people on the street from being in a situation in 10, 20 years as we are now, paying ridiculous amounts for fuel.
So is the contention that today we have fundamentally uncompetitive markets and the worry that in the future we will have equally uncompetitive markets? Right, okay. I don't know that we've really got the time to unpick all of the aspects of that, because it starts to get us into some very deep water. All I would say is, look, admission from me, I used to be a petrol pump attendant, and believe me, you make a lot more money out of the coffee than you do out of flogging the petrol, even at especially at today's prices, frankly. There's a bit of lead and lag in there, but not an awful lot. It's upstream, right, where the money is made. Just as today, electricity retailers aren't exactly making a lot of money. The money is made in the delta between the generating cost and the wholesale price. So it's just the way that market, anyway, never mind. Well, yeah, further discussion, absolutely.
Can I add one thing,
let's get another question going.
Could I add one thing?
Sorry.
There was just a really interesting piece of work done last year by the Competition and Markets Authority. So they sort of looked at the market now for the charging infrastructure market, and and came to some really interesting findings. So as government, we have, with the infrastructure strategy, we also published a response to their investigation, and we have basically accepted most of their findings. So there are things that we can do now to try and set up a competitive market in the long term, yes.
How about the gentleman at the front here?
Thank you. So it's this is Joel from Co-Charger, for those who don't know. It's a hypothetical or semi-hypothetical question, and I think the answers might be very illuminating and interesting. How would all of this be different if everybody could charge when they were at home? I don't mean to be awkward, it's just a talent, but I thought that might be an interesting one.
Well, I think it would be different. It's difficult to say how different, but it would be, because you're leaving a house every morning with a full charge, potentially, if every single person could charge at home. Yeah, but very difficult to know the numbers. I mean, you'll still need some en route charging, because you still might do a journey that's longer than the range of your car. And I think in time, once people have got more comfortable with charging and recharging, we'll start to see battery sizes come down in cars as well, which should reduce the cost of the car and help more people to get into them. I think short term, we've probably got to go through a cycle where people want a 300-mile range because they need to get over that nervousness of how to charge and where to charge. But I would hope that you'd start to see that come down, use fewer earth metals, that kind of stuff, feed through. But don't know the answer.
I mean, I think, Talia, your number was 70% is home charging? 74, sorry. Yeah, I mean, obviously that number would be in the 90s if everybody could home charge. But I still think that from a point of view of fleets and people that don't necessarily bring their vehicle back to home and long journeys and frankly convenience, so some of the sites that are out there today are actually really convenient. I went to the Shell. I was coming in from the west this morning and went to the Shell and I'm an ex-BP guy, so I shouldn't be saying this. Really great site, really easy. I wanted a coffee on my way into town. I stopped for 10 minutes, or 15 minutes, I got 25% charge. Frankly, I would have done that, and I did charge at home last night. So I think the habit of people fueling on the go will still exist. I think the numbers would go from 74 to 90. But the reality is that, 40% of Brits can't charge at home. So, and the infrastructure cost of putting charging at home for those people would be way, way higher than providing rapid charging hubs elsewhere. So that's a huge investment that would make it to get everybody charging at home. And I personally don't think it would be worth it. I think there are better ways to spend our money.
I would start off by saying, short of getting rid of quite a large proportion of the UK's housing stock, it's almost impossible for people to be able to guarantee to charge at home. I think the other thing is whether the network actually could cope with it. So, at the moment, people are putting home chargers in ones and twos in a road, and actually that's fine and it's not a big problem. I think in some areas the network will get really, really stressed, actually, when everybody's trying to charge overnight. And I think you'll still have a situation, even if we've all got a home charger, where there will be some vehicles that come out in the morning for various different reasons that aren't full. You might have two vehicles, for example. You might have visitors, you might be on holiday, you might be at a hotel. There's lots of other scenarios where you're not going to be able to make use of your home charger. Those of us that have home charging, and I don't at the moment, but I have had historically, yes, you charge 90% at home and you wouldn't want to do anything else. But that there is that ongoing need, if people are moving vehicles around, to be able to charge. What happens if you had a power cut in your area overnight? If there's no public infrastructure, does that mean that whole area can't go to work in the morning?
I mean, yeah, lots of good points already raised. I think collectively our jobs would be a bit easier. And actually, it's an interesting, I've been sitting here sort of doing the thought experiment, and actually some of the big things we would be worrying about are things that we should be worrying about now, but we're probably prioritising the people who don't have that parking. So, yeah, it is a really interesting question to think about because it makes you think, question all of the priorities, given that we want such a focus on home charging.
All I would add from an energy system point of view is that, again, it absolutely would reinforce the essential need for smart charging. But because it opens up the potential for more of the demand to be subjected to smart charging, it could have a broadly beneficial impact over on the overall need to reinforce the network capacity. So, if with smart charging could be quite a good thing, without smart charging, then it could be quite a scary thing. But then it becomes a subset of electrification of heat anyway, from that point of view. And Tom.
Too kind, Philip, because obviously this is a controversial subject. Just a quick observation on some assumptions that have been thrown around low utilization for on-street charging. I think that is a narrative that we shouldn't accept lightly. There's no reason why there should be low utilization of a shared charger. Let's say you have 10 houses sharing a charger each. Typically an average household charges about 1.2 times a week. So you get 14 charging events per week, and you'll have high utilization in that circumstance. So I don't think we should just allow that to be assumed as an assumption. And secondly, I'm a bit confused about this whole thing, inspired by the model. If rapid charging is so profitable and is such a great business model, why, firstly, are we subsidizing it to such a huge degree through Project Rapid? £1 billion of taxpayers' money committed, more or less 950 million committed to that. And secondly, why are prices not already falling, given the high utilization that we're apparently seeing in the rapid charging infrastructure? To Joe's point around what is the true behavior of the likely owners of the rapid charging networks. And thirdly, just an observation on that, and it may not apply to some of the larger oil majors who already have some of their own infrastructure, but there are other costs which are also going up in the rapid charging space we're seeing. And if you speak to some of the institutional investors, the fact is it's been seen as a very good business to be charging increasing rents to. So I think that all of these you can allow narratives to develop in a certain way, and that's why this report has triggered such a sort of strong reaction. But I think it's very important not to let them go unchecked as assumptions. So really the question is, if it's such a good business model, why are we subsidizing it so much?
Do you want to respond first?
Yeah, personally, Tom, I wouldn't subsidize rapid charging as a business model. Why haven't we seen more of it? I think because the vehicles haven't been there, and now we're seeing the number of vehicles increasing, but not just that, the certainty of the numbers increasing in the future, which we haven't always had. So all these business plans are based on 10-year forecasts or 15-year forecasts or whatever, and now there's much more certainty about the future adoption of electric vehicles, and I think I think BP announced $1 billion last week of investment in this sort of space. That's the response you're getting now that there's more certainty on the demand. But I can't speak for.
Would you call to not subsidise through Project Rapid now if you were BP?
I'm not BP, to be clear. I personally, I would focus on those areas of the ecosystem which really need to support. And I actually think if you believe that the answer is that residential consumers will want to residential consumers without off-street parking will want to charge near their residence, then that's an area that I would be putting incentives behind, as well as rural and these other low utilization spaces. And I wouldn't put it, and I'm not speaking as BP, I'm not speaking as a government representative, and I just had a small input to this report, so just to be clear.
Katie?
So Tom, I agree with a lot of your questions, as in they're worth digging into and trying to get to the bottom of. And I think it's right that we continue to challenge the assumptions that are being made. The reason why the Rapid Charging Fund exists is because you can't move the roads, and so the government isn't planning to subsidise rapid charging hubs across the country, you know, because we see that that's a part of the market that is doing really, really well, actually, and lots of investment is going into it. But specifically along motorways and major A roads, there are many places, some places will be fine, but there are many places where the grid infrastructure is just not very close to the motorway, and we can't move the motorway, so we have to bring the grid infrastructure to the motorway. And that's the part that the Rapid Charging Fund will help, not necessarily 100%, but will help pay for. So it's not actually going to be subsidising charge point infrastructure, it's going to be subsidising the work of bringing the grid to the road. So there is from the government perspective, a strong argument for investing in that, and a much weaker argument for subsidising rapid charging as a whole.
I think that's where the variability in those grid connection costs is really important, because this model shows a lot of averages, and I think it's really difficult to get an average figure for a grid connection cost. So yes, in a lot of instances you don't need the support because it will make sense, but there will be some examples where the pylon's a mile away, it's got to come through a housing estate, you've got to do an awful lot of work, and I think that's where the fund will be targeted. It's not going to be a blanket fund that applies to averages that come out of a model. I think we just need to be really careful about averages and real life.
Can I just add to that? The way that network charging works in terms of grid applications is if there's an upgrade needed or something is required in order to connect, then anybody who makes that application gets all of that cost on their grid offer. It's not socialised across people who are looking to connect. So you suddenly reach a point where nobody can unlock the market in certain locations because that cost is so big, it makes everything unviable. But once that cost is funded, actually it unlocks a whole load of other things that people can then invest in. And the second comers pay some of that back. So in some respects, it's pump priming, and you need to do it to unlock the market in those locations because the costs are so disproportionate, even with the benefits of the rapid charge business model. It does look pretty good, but it still won't be enough in some locations to unlock what are really quite disproportionate grid costs.
Absolutely. This could go on and on, and I'm really worried about time. So, look, can we make this the very final question? And if you've got a really short question, that would be extra brownie points. Oh gosh, too many people. There's a gentleman there just behind Tom who's had his hand up for a while.
Hi, I'm Conor McGlone. I'm a journalist for the Engineering and Technology magazine. I'm interested in, we haven't touched on safety in any part of this. I'm interested because the OZEF has written to installers in the private scheme, the EVHS scheme, to say that 10% of the chargers installed were potentially dangerous. And that translates to thousands of potentially dangerous charge points. And so I think it's quite an interesting area to look at. And so my question for Katie was, in that, the next audit, I believe, is underway. I'm just wondering if you had any initial findings on what the safety is looking like in that sphere at the moment, and also what you're kind of looking at in the public domain, because if there is such an issue, which it seems to be privately, surely this is something we're looking at in the public charging networks.
Yeah, I don't have sight of any initial findings to share, I'm afraid. But, I mean, it's a really important point. Safety is absolutely essential. And also really important because we don't want to undermine people's confidence in charging and charge points, and they can and should be safe. I think one thing that OZEV needs to look at, particularly as we start to wind down our our support for home charging is how that's been our mechanism through which we sort of audit safety of home charge points. We need to find a different way of doing that. So that's something that we're definitely going to think about.
I could join in to say that tech from a manufacturing perspective has got a lot of like built-in energy leakage, etc. So I think that's where, from a manufacturing perspective, there's a lot of built-in electrical components that protect some of these eventualities.
Good, thank you. And perhaps that could be something that the next panel might touch on as we worry about whether or not we are going to have something that is usable, and part of being usable has to be being safe. But anyway, look, with that, really excellent debate, punchy questions, and some really insightful and illuminating responses from the panel. So thank you very much.
Right, thank you, Phil. So I'm going to have to constrain my panel a little bit, but if I can invite my panel who are here to talk about charge points being used, usable, visible, accessible, connected, secure and interoperable. So we haven't got much to cover, have we? So I'm very pleased to say that to join me to discuss that is Martin Adams, who is head of Smart Energy, it's EV Energy and Smart Policy, I think. Is that right?
It's a ridiculously long government title. I switched off a bit. That'll do.
That'll do. So, Martin, please join me on the podium here. I've also got Bridget Phelps, who's joining us from EVA England. Bridget, thank you very much indeed. Stuart Fowler, who's actually joining us to replace Lorna, who was due to join us from National Grid, but Stuart is from WPD, who have been bought by National Grid, so by default he's almost National Grid. Nearly, indeed. And Catherine Morris from... apologies, Catherine. Sorry. So our panel is here, so Catherine, sorry, from Motability, yes, of course. So our panel here is to really look at these aspects, and the money always takes all the limelight, but this is actually more about the information, the usability, and I think probably I wanted to start with a little bit about smart. We've emphasised how important smart is going to be. And if we're going to restrict the amount of money we have to spend on wires in the ground and things, smart is absolutely critical. So I just wanted to sort of pick up, in particular, Martin, from your perspective, how are we going to get smart embedded into this at the level that we need to? And I know Stuart's had some experience of trying to do this within a fleet environment, so experience of trying to make it smart and what gets in the way. Martin.
Thank you. So, smart for EVs, I mean, building on some of the comments we talked about earlier today, I mean, I think optimistically you can see EVs as a pioneer when it comes to deployment of a smart and flexible energy system. They're equally the canary in the mine. So there's a lot of attention on EVs to pave the way for what flexibility might look like, but we've alluded to heat earlier, so we'll also be, looking for smart heating, smart other consumer appliances, potentially smart in public charging context where appropriate. Now, the benefit of this is huge. You're talking about a flexible energy system as a whole could save £10 billion a year from around 2050 as part of the way that we reduce the need for network reinforcement, we reduce the need for new generation. Those are savings which directly benefit consumers who might charge overnight instead of as soon as they get home and plug in their vehicle while cooking their dinner and turning the heating on. But there are also benefits which we'd expect to apply to consumers even if they don't have EVs because they lower energy system costs as a whole. Now, delivering all of that requires a whole range of measures. So it requires the enabling technology, so things like the smart charge points essentially in this context. It requires the right market signals. It requires the right standardization between companies providing charge points and flexibility services and the market who are seeking those, and aggregators and dynamic time of use tariffs. So there's a whole body of work there. And those benefits also come with risks attached. So if we end up with suddenly everyone picking, cheapest tariff, every charge point comes on in synchrony at 2 a.m, then that is a very sudden peak in demand. Equally, if someone maliciously decided to turn on or off a large number of charge points at the same time as a result of a cybersecurity attack, that could also create challenges to the energy system. So alongside this benefit, there's risk associated. Now, I think the regulations that we put through just late last year around mandating smart charge points, that's a great first step. It's not the only thing we'll have to do. And there's a whole world of work more to be done, both look at those wider systems as well as look at how we get those sort of market signals around and get those right too.
Brilliant, thanks Martin. And Stuart, from your side, smart and how is smart working in a fleet environment?
Before I joined Western Power, I worked for Centrica, and Centrica is a partner on a project called Optimise Prime, where and I didn't come up with the name, by the way, so don't blame me. But Optimise Prime is looking at 3 different fleets: Royal Mail, depot-based, British Gas, it's home-based, and then Uber, which is en route and home. And I think the key, and I think in a way this translates to most fleets for me, is that, of course, you've got a person in a van or some kind of vehicle, and they tend to take them to a destination. And for British Gas, it just happens to be home. And of course, trying to charge whatever it is, 9,500 vans at home, how do you optimise that, in a way in which is great for the grid, but equally great for the guys and the girls that take these vans home. And so Optimise Prime was trying to test this and how we could then integrate the vans into the home solution and then dispatch them in response to a pricing signal from UK Power Networks. And they've successfully done that, and they've done that as well for Royal Mail through the depot trial. And I think the same would apply to National Grid, to Western Power Distribution. We've got these relatively large fleets. Some of them will be depot-based, some of them will take their vehicles home. And it's how you maximise the opportunity, but equally, going back to, I think, some of the conversation today, it has to be about them when they take the van home. It has to be about the user experience, because, of course, if that user experience is great in the home, when they're charging the van and it's all nice and easy, when they go and visit a customer, it should help them in having a nice discussion with customers about the transition to electric vehicles. And it happened to me. British Gas van turns up at my house the other day, a nice shiny brand new van, and he's the engineer was home based, but of course he didn't have a driveway, so he had a great story to tell about how great his van was, but it was a mixed experience using public infrastructure.
Absolutely, thank you. And that, excuse me, that brings me neatly on. So one of the things, Bridget, is, as EV England, you've got a community of EV drivers there, engaged drivers. So how do we get that community to think smartly and charge smartly? Is that something that you find that they're already engaged in? Have we won that battle about making EV charging smart with the user community that you're working with?
I think a lot of the user community are very open and using smart charging, and as early adopters. There's also a lot of people, obviously, who adopted EVs very early, who have also got a generating energy. They've got PV panels, they've got other home energy, they're looking at heat pumps. So basically, I think there's a lot of people who are responding well, and that the market signals show that the wider consumer group of people adopting EVs, I think people will get the message, and I think particularly now energy prices have been they're so much higher, there's so much in the press. So I think consumers will respond. I think there's things that we're looking at through EVET, which we're looking at consumer protections. And as long as we all work together to make sure that we look at the fact that tariffs need to be clear, that consumers are clear that they need smart meters if they're looking at doing smart charging at home, There's some of the things there that we need to make sure are in place, but I think existing EV drivers, a lot of them are very open to this and using it.
Certainly that's my experience. And I think that's where I wanted to bring you in, Catherine. I mean, obviously, as Motability, you've got one of the biggest fleets of vehicles out there within your... And clearly that's a fleet that's all drivers. It's not just EV-centric drivers. So I'm really interested, you know, there's always a danger with this community that we're preaching to the choir, if you like, in terms of we're all sat there and there's a percentage of EV drivers. What are you seeing in terms of a fleet of users and how we engage them in this transition that we're all trying to charge forward with?
Absolutely. So first of all, I think that the infrastructure has to be accessible for that group that we're talking about. So Motability is a national disability charity. We oversee the Motability scheme through which if you're a disabled person in the UK and you receive certain benefits, you can exchange that for a lease on a vehicle, a powered scooter, a powered wheelchair. There's currently over 600,000 people who are scheme customers. I think this is something that isn't as widely known as it should be, that there is this huge market of consumers that may have different access needs than what people are usually thinking about. We started working in the space about 2 years ago. I heard some anecdotal feedback. People were worried about public charging infrastructure in particular. How are they going to actually physically access it? We did a first piece of research with Ricardo Consulting. We wanted to understand the size of the problems. How many people are we talking about who might experience these access issues? But also, what could potential solutions be? That report came back and suggested, based on housing data and Blue Badge data, there's going to be 2.7 million disabled drivers or passengers in the UK by 2035, with up to half, so that's nearly 1.4 million disabled people reliant on public charging because of their particular home parking situation. We looked at that number and said, wow, this is going to be a big issue that we need to start talking about. That piece of research also identified that although there were people in the industry who said, oh yeah, we haven't thought of that, we should probably think about that. What do you mean by accessible? That was always the question that people got back. And we realized there was a lot of work that needed to be done to define exactly what we mean by accessible charging. We also looked at other countries, so we looked at your usual market leaders and kind of said, have they done anything on accessible charging? Found that they hadn't. So we started a project to create the world's first accessible charging standard, which has just gone out this week to public consultation. I think what's been really positive about this experience is how much input there's been from industry and people recognizing we didn't think about this enough, but actually we need to think about this. First of all, morally, it's the right thing to do. We don't want to leave anyone behind in this transition. It's too important. But second of all, it's also commercially quite an attractive case because you don't want to end up having to retrofit infrastructure 10 years down the line where there are hundreds of thousands of disabled drivers on the road who can't access that infrastructure. We can get into talking about some of the issues, everything from high curbs to heavy cables to talking about digital exclusion. I think that's really important as well. Lots of people having to download apps who may not have access to smartphones. So I think there's a whole range of access issues to talk about. We tried to address through the standard. But I think for me, the thing that needs to happen to make sure that community is engaged is to show that you're listening and also to input into the standard and look at uptaking it as well. It's a standard. We don't want it to sit on the shelf. We need everyone involved in EV charging infrastructure, whether that's site owners, local councils, charge point providers, to be thinking about making this change and making it quickly so that people are confident and feel like they actually can transition to an EV.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add, because we've been working with Motability since last year, and the standard that's out for consultation, as James mentioned earlier, we're running a webinar on it next week, Thursday the 7th, 2 o'clock. The details will be on our website tomorrow. And if you're interested, it's basically looking at the consultation, looking at the questions it's raising, and trying to publicise it and to encourage as many drivers and people in general to respond to it.
If you want to take a look at that standard, it's on the British Standards Institution website. And again, massive thanks to OZEV for being the co-sponsor in the standards. I think it lended it a lot of kind of legitimacy and credibility and also importance that government also sees accessibility as a priority.
Absolutely, and yeah, fully endorse everything you said, Catherine and Bridget. And I think you touched on an important point there about digital accessibility. So, you know, we've got the physical, and there's really some you know, good work going on there. But this digital accessibility, and you know, as a somewhat old engineer, even I'm finding it difficult with all of these different apps and, you know, conflicting sort of apps trying to control my car and my charger and my home all the time. I mean, do you think, I guess it's a question to the whole, we're now moving into this mainstream of consumers. We're not the geeks and the EV drivers that are prepared to take some risks and some have some challenges. Are we doing enough to really get the rest of the drivers out there to engage in this and all of these things that we're talking about? Smart charging, charging on the fly, and all the apps and things like that. I mean, Bridget, from your side, do you think there's more we need to do? I may be leading the witness here. Apologies.
Well, I think it's great that we've got the consumer experience response from the government, because actually I think that's going to be really helpful and going to make it much easier now to make the case for people and dispel some of the myths that are around. And also, once we see reliability really improve across all networks, that will be very helpful. I suspect as an industry, I mean, EV drivers are the best and fantastic advocates, and I think we can all work together to share the knowledge and the information, give people the chance to try an EV, encourage people to go to dealers and just try driving them, because I think that's really practical and useful. And I suspect that actually looking at the report that you've put out today, actually working together to do some shared information, to make sure that the language we're using is consistent, to make sure that we're promoting smart charging with clear messages which aren't too full of jargon. I'm sure there's some more things we can do to work together around that.
Martin, any?
Yeah, I think two things come to mind in particular, one of which is it's completely the right point about digital inclusion, and that's not just the case for smart charging, that's the case for smart energy system as a whole, and certainly I know a number of colleagues in BEIS are spending a lot of time considering that aspect of the energy system. And I think the second thing also is around how to ensure that we're embedding the right messages wherever consumers go. So, for instance, we've been looking within BEIS at creating, say, a pilot website with the Energy Savings Trust. I think we mentioned on slides earlier today, providing advice. But actually, the key thing is getting the messages. People don't go to a government website. They will, we need to be proactive, so it's in there when people are talking to their dealers, when they're looking around, whether it's Auto Express or Auto Trader or the, energy suppliers' websites. It's trying to come up with that consistent messaging and that consistency wherever people turn. And I think there's a real value and role for organisations like EVET, which brings those voices together, to think also about how you can sort of manage that messaging to make sure that consumers can access that information wherever they are. And there can be shared ways to do that too.
Stuart, do you want to chip in?
So I think having worked on both sides, I've worked in retail as well as distribution. I think the lens I tend to look at these things is that this is consumer led. This is about customers at the end of the day, and I agree. I think this has to be about having a consistent message. It's about collaboration. We do a lot of collaborative projects in the innovation team. This won't happen unless we all sing from the same hymn sheet. Terrible phrase, I know, but we have to, otherwise, we will not get the message out to consumers that if you like, that having an EV is intrinsically linked to this flexible energy system, because otherwise, the alternative is, a lot of reinforcement, and it just has to be done. We need to find a way in which we do it.
And Catherine, in terms of engaging the mass market, if you like, that aren't already trying to plug in and find their way around an electric vehicle?
I think people underestimate the value of user testing. So I think a lot of times we'll kind of get approaches, or people are saying, oh, we think this is a fantastic new accessible product or innovation. And the first question will always be, have you tested it with the people who are going to use it? I think a lot of the user testing we do doesn't consider other groups that are actually really important and we want to be included in this transition. So I guess one plea I would kind of make to the audience is, if you're develop kind of a product or a new way of working, bring disabled people in to be a part of that process. So we have a lot of kind of resources and reports available on our website where we've done exactly that with another charity called Designability, where they've actually, we've arranged for disabled people to access different kinds of charge points with different vehicles and tell us exactly what worked for them and what didn't. And that's, again, a resource that's available to everyone because we're a charity and we want everyone to be able to use it. So I think again, I think it goes back to making sure you're including people and making it a people-centric, consumer-led process, rather than assuming that because something works from an engineering perspective, it's going to work for the end user.
Absolutely. I will take maximum two questions, just because I'm conscious of time. So if there are two burning questions, up at the back, Howard had his hand up very prominently, and I'll take this one down at the front.
Hi, I'm Paul, CEO of Beamer and involved in this for some number of years. In terms of new housing and existing housing, in terms of the interoperability, smart charging, safety, etc., to what extent do we think that's the role of the Levelling Up and Local Government Department to actually put forward regulations or guidance, depending on your perspective, to make sure that new build housing and any refurbishment are fully given, shall we say, the right push towards getting these systems in place? There are some, in my view, there are some things they can do and some things they shouldn't do, but I'd be interested to know what you all thought.
So I think you're right that there are some things different government departments are well placed to and less well placed to do. What I think is important, though, is this has got to be a joined up whole of government effort on net zero. In terms of the EV transition, there's roles for BEIS, there's roles for DFT as a massive centre stage there, and as the owner of that policy. And yes, certainly through the discussions we have, we talk with I'm going to get the acronym wrong, aren't I? Because they've changed the name still so recently, with the Levelling Up Department, and lots of work that goes on in dialogue there about the potential role or where there needs to be kind of consideration around building regulations like too. So no one department has the right answer.
Thanks, Martin. I'll take the question at the front here, and then apologies because I'm running over time.
I promise it's quite quick. So accessibility is really important to us, and we read your user engagement report and took everything we could from that to develop our charger, and we're heavily involved in, we're going to produce something for your consultation as well, because we think it's really important. This accessibility piece is, you've got a big fleet of vehicles. The faster we can get those vehicles through electrified and into the second-hand market is better for everybody, really. You're a great conduit for going through. Having read those two documents that have come out, every time I see a charger now, some of them are not going to be accessible. Yeah. Are you hoping to create, other than, a guide or say this charger isn't accessible for disabled people? Or are you hoping to have that bit of hardware swapped out for something that is accessible?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the draft standard at the moment is basically proposing developing a kind of checklist where when you read the draft standard, and hopefully it's going to be finalized by the summer, you could go through and against that checklist, against the main features, kind of say, okay, the sites we're looking at do have these features or don't have these features. And so then you can understand whether or not you meet the standard. I think there's more that needs to be done here that we're still exploring about what's the best way to encourage uptake. And obviously we have to have those conversations in partnership with OZEV as the co-sponsor of the standard. But I think there is more to be done, and that standard is the most complete specification you can find of where we are at the moment. We're also doing a separate project, again, with Designability, this disability and design charity that I mentioned earlier, of almost how do you translate that standard? Because for a lot of people who are really technical and have an engineering background, that standard is exactly what they're looking for. But for a lot of people in industry, it might feel like some parts of the standard are relevant, some are less relevant, and how do we kind of translate that and show practical examples of how that standard could be achieved. So again, we're doing that work with Designability and hope to have some resources to share this summer that kind of say, look, this is a type of design or prototype that wouldn't meet the standard for X, Y, and Z reasons, because I think that translation element is really important to make sure people feel confident in the standard and being able to use it.
I'll speak really loudly.
Yeah.
How is that going to then be communicated to the local authorities so that then falls into their tenders so they really know what they're looking for? I mean, I've been talking to them the last couple of days, and they seem to be surprised that there's a consultation going on.
Yeah, so we've done our best to reach out to local authorities. So we had some articles in the Local Government Association's newsletter. We spoke to their transport team. I've probably had between 30 and 40 councils approach me over the past 6 months and say, oh goodness, we're hearing about this accessibility thing, let's talk and let's understand what we can do better, which is really fantastic that some councils have been that proactive. But I think this goes back to some of the government's proposals around kind of funding for resource in those local areas. A lot of local authorities don't have an EV officer looking at this, really proactively reaching out to us saying, what can we do better from accessibility? Hopefully that's due to change in the future because local councils are going to be a key part of this. And I think we did have our first example of one local partnership kind of holding a workshop based on the research we did and using that as part of their procurement process to determine then which charge point provider that they selected. So I think that is an ideal for us where that's happening kind of at the national level as a standard, but it's also being implemented on the local level. So I think it's definitely something that that industry needs to start thinking about if you want to be competitive in winning those contracts.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to draw it to a close there because I know we're overrunning time. I think the key plea that hopefully the panel will support is actually communication is critical. The more we talk about this stuff and share what's going on and then share it outside in our communities, the more chance we've got of delivering this. So if I can thank Catherine, Stuart, Martin and Bridget for joining me on the phone. If you'd like to take your seats, thank you very much. I do feel a little bit of fraud throwing you off the stage and standing here. My apologies, but I hope you will be joining us for a drink and that there will be an opportunity for anyone to collar them and actually ask the questions that you were burning to ask before. But just to wrap up, it falls to me to kind of we've told you what we're going to tell you, and then we've told you through all these panels, and now I'm going to tell you what we've told you, again, effectively. So I will do it very quickly, hopefully. But we thought it was really important to actually just bring out very clearly the key recommendations that this whole EVET process has emerged with. They're embedded in the report, the last 4 or 5 pages of the report. And really they fall under 5 key themes, and under those there's a handful of key recommendations with a number of sort of sub-recommendations below that. So there's a lot of granularity, a lot of detail in there. But I just wanted to highlight, and I think we've heard most of this before, hopefully none of this will be a surprise, but there's no doubt, and we're seeing it everywhere through all of the standards and proposals and papers that have come out recently. We've got to build this ahead of need. We can't wait until the demand for a charge point is so ripe that people are standing there waiting for it. We've got to have the charge points available ahead of need. And to do that, we've heard that the government and financial sectors have got to develop some financial support mechanisms. We know there's going to need to be some targeted funding, and it's important that we've got to target that in quite a focused way. And we've heard a little bit from Katie and the team about how that might need to be done through the rapid charging, and we've got to do the same thing in terms of the local infrastructures as well. Obviously, that network investment is critical, and Ofgem and government really need to look at that and look at that investment and link it to the local area energy plans. This localisation, this getting the local authorities to engage with it is absolutely critical, and we've heard that throughout the day. And we need to really simplify those processes. We can't afford for it to be taking 2 years to get a major grid upgrade into planning or whatever. We've got to streamline that. We've got to do this faster than we've probably ever done these things in the past. Local authorities, a key highlight, and it really rang through all of the EVET work, and they need the resources. We absolutely welcome the announcement within the OZEV strategy that they've realised that they're going to provide support to get those resources in place. We know from our work across a number of regimes that the local authorities and the personnel within the local authorities are just stretched every which way. So giving them the tools, the support, and funding a bit of resource is going to be critical. So that, I would say that we've already got that recommendation being picked up very squarely within the OZEV, that government needs to ensure the local authorities have those resources. And we also know about the DNOs. Those DNOs We've got some really, really well-informed DNOs with a lot of really quite valuable data now. And I think it's about sharing that knowledge and really pushing those into the local authorities, working together, getting energy, transport and planning all operating as one, great sort of vibrant community that really grapples with this together. We've heard just now, the public charge points have got to be used and usable, they've got to be visible, accessible, connected, secure and interoperable. I couldn't fit it all in the title there. But I think that is, again, critical, and there's lots and lots of little nuggets within that we need to grapple with. As we've said, the strategy for the national data connectivity, a lot of data, a digital map of all of these charge points, their availability, their rating and all of that. We really need to get that in place so that the consumers can see where they can charge, how quickly they can charge, when they need to charge, and really make the charge point network that we do put in place really really sing for us and sweat that asset. We've got to get that minimum level of service, and again, I think that's been picked up squarely within the OZEV strategy. And again, credit to government, and it's not something I always do. When they pay me, I often do, but credit to government where they are applying regulations where there is a market failure. 2 years ago, we talked about charge point availability, we talked about some of these things and said, well, if we need to regulate, if we need to use the powers in the automated electric vehicles bill, we will. And to their credit, this is when we need to use those powers. Let's apply them and apply them rapidly. Local authorities, minimum performance criteria in the procurement, and we've heard a bit about that local authority procurement. Again, let's make sure they know what they have to procure and how they procure it, helping them get to that. And then making those the charge points and the data open and accessible. And there's a real interface and tension between the vehicle data and the charge point data and the energy system data, and how we connect up those dots to really make, again, the vehicle as a piece of this jigsaw work harmoniously with the energy system, and that's it's quite a challenge. This is not an easy aspect. And then smart charging wherever appropriate. We've heard smart is going to be critical. If we're not smart, we're going to be broke. That's kind of the takeaway. So we've got to have smart chargers, we've got to have that smart network, those smart systems, and we need to get smart consumers to engage with it. And that may be the biggest barrier. So I think this communication activity is going to be critical. We've got to be looking at how those charge points, where they are long duration, long dwell time, we make that smart in whatever way we can. We've got to look at the reforms on the electricity market to look at that flexibility as well, and that's a critical area. And then these data sharing standards, again, these protocols and the how we get data shared so that smartness can be optimised, not only within the stuff we're putting in the ground now, but when you look forward to the electrification of other aspects, we're going to need even more smartness and even more smart consumers. And the last one, and it's a particular passion of ours within Zemo, and I think it's an area where we've got to do more. And I don't think we fully understand how ill-informed the average consumer is. I judge most things by my older sister, and I was berating her yesterday about trying to getting an electric vehicle, and it was the same old trite rubbish that was coming out. She's not watching, so she won't mind me saying that. We really have a big challenge just to get the large bulk of consumers over the hurdle of accepting an electric vehicle before we start talking to them about smart charging and energy tariffs and things like that. And I think we as a community underestimate the scale of that, and we really should be looking at a public information campaign, and as I say, a personal quest of ours and of Zemo within this, and there's an activity going on as we speak in Working Group 2 on that. We also need to support the disadvantaged consumers. As Phil touched on, this just transition, you hear the term a lot, but what does it mean? What it means is electricity prices need to be fair and equitable, and we hear that from the motor industry, that they need to see that. We hear it from government, and we hear it from the energy industry as well. So how we deliver that, given what's going on, is going to be critical. And this consistent consumer protections. It's got to work. Safety point that was raised, all of these have to be embedded into it. So lots and lots of granular detail, but probably the most reassuring thing is that an awful lot of this detail and these recommendations have been adopted widely and particularly within the OZEV strategy. So the work we've been putting in has certainly resonated and is hopefully bubbling up into the places it needs to bubble up. And now we can move on to the next stage and take it forward. I will stop there and hand over to Phil because he's in the way of my drink. So, Phil.
That was brilliantly done, Andy. I'm going to be very, very, very quick, much quicker than I was earlier, for which I apologise. Look, I mean, I think the general statement is, and what's been behind so much of the work and the thing that's been going on over the last 2.5 years or so, you know, I think there's when we think about public charging infrastructure, we're thinking about retail models in the end. And for any retail environment, yeah, volume and price and cost are the three things. And we can put labels on different formats, but, you know, a format that is out of whack on one or two or all three of those dimensions is going to be less advantaged than a format that actually hits really well the sweet spot on those three dimensions. It's not particularly, you know, sort of contentious as a proposition. The other proposition is that ultimately we'll be operating in a world of very competitive, open markets. Now, there are, as we heard in one of the panels, there are risks around whether that really can play through because of some of the, you know, peculiarities of place. But that, again, has been a sort of a foundational assumption. If you believe in markets, then the more competitive, the more efficient formats will win. The less efficient formats will, over time, fall aside. That's why we only have 8,000 petrol stations in this country today. All right, they've got bigger, they've got more efficient. As they've done that, they've priced out the weaker players. That's what Sainsbury's, Tesco and Asda did to the vast majority of the petrol stations that were owned by other brands. And that is the logic that sits behind a lot of the work that's been done here. And when we talk about the sweet spot, it is talking about how you might characterize something that conforms to that logic, but nonetheless is seeking to address the demands of providing the confidence to consumers to be able to make the transition to electric vehicles. And it's getting that balance right that plays through this. So don't get stressed about the labels that have been put on things. Think of it instead just in terms of the relative merits of different formats and their efficiency and the role they might play as the market matures. There is also clearly a lot more to be done. We've celebrated an awful lot of great achievements already in across the ecosystem, but as the panel debates have shown up, and as we all know in our hearts, there is still far more to be done. And I'm looking forward to us being able to continue the great collaboration that's helped us support the momentum that's been generated across the multiplicity of actors that have been engaged and are engaged in driving us forward here. And I do hope and I do think that EVET, or a version of EVET, has a role to play in helping act as a binding agent in that conversation as we move forward. Finally, though, and most importantly, I need to say thank you. First of all, thank you to everyone who's here and who's watching the live stream. Thank you for your participation, your brilliant questions, and I hope for the good company that we are about to enjoy as we have a glass together downstairs. But thank you especially to the team from Zemo, who have done such a brilliant job in organising all of this and making sure that things are working really well and have, even if my senses aren't betraying me, have managed to work some magic with the heating in this room. So with that, everyone, thank you very much indeed, and I'll look forward to having a drink with you in a minute.